Don't turn that camera off. Jimin's voice cracked the second the podcast staff tried to cut the recording. The room went dead silent. Even Jungkook stopped breathing for a moment. If people really want to know why I never left Jungkook, then fine. I'll tell them what happened that night. One of the female crew members suddenly covered her mouth, already crying before the story even started. RM slowly looked away. Taehyung froze. And Jungkook? He just stared at the floor, like he already knew this moment would destroy everything. Before we continue, comment below where you're watching from, and tell me honestly, if you were Jimin, would you have stayed with Jungkook after what happened? Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share this channel, because tonight, we're opening one of the oldest BTS secrets that was never supposed to reach the public.
The podcast studio didn't feel like a studio anymore. It felt like a confession room. The lights were too bright. The air felt heavy. Nobody from the staff moved. Jimin sat there with trembling hands while Jungkook stayed beside him, unusually quiet. Fans always thought their relationship was simple, loyal, unbreakable, but nobody knew the truth. Nobody knew there was a moment years ago when Jimin actually tried to disappear from Jungkook forever. And what Jungkook did afterward terrified every single BTS member. Even now, years later, nobody in that room was prepared to hear the full story. And the worst part? Jimin was finally ready to say the one thing he had hidden from the world this entire time. The red recording light inside the studio stayed on, but nobody spoke for almost 10 seconds. It felt longer. Jimin kept staring at the glass table in front of him while the podcast host looked completely unsure whether to continue or stop the interview. Normally, BTS interviews were loud. Somebody always laughed. Somebody interrupted the silence. But tonight was different. Even Hoseok, who usually tried to save every awkward situation, stayed quiet in the corner with his arms crossed. Jungkook leaned back in his chair, jaw tight, eyes unfocused like he already knew exactly where this story was heading. Then Jimin finally inhaled slowly and said something nobody expected. The first time I tried to leave Jungkook, he followed me in the rain for almost 3 hours. The staff immediately looked at each other. One camera operator lowered his headset. RM rubbed his forehead the second those words came out. It was obvious this was not some funny behind-the-scenes memory anymore. This was something deeper, something ugly. Jimin let out a weak laugh, but there was no happiness in it. "You all think he's the strong one," he whispered, "but you never saw how broken he became." The host carefully asked, "What happened that night?" Jimin didn't answer immediately. His fingers trembled against the microphone. Then the memory finally hit him again. 7 years earlier, old BTS dorm, around 2 in the morning. The rain outside was violent enough to shake the windows. The dorm lights were mostly off except for the kitchen. Jimin stood there alone wearing a black hoodie while staring at his packed bag near the door. His breathing was uneven, his eyes swollen from crying. The company pressure had been destroying him for months. Endless schedules, constant comparisons, online hate, rumors, injuries, exhaustion. And somewhere in the middle of all that chaos, his relationship with Jungkook started becoming something dangerous. Not toxic, worse, dependent. Nobody noticed it at first because BTS members were naturally close already. Sleeping in the same rooms, traveling together constantly, protecting each other from pressure. But with Jimin and Jungkook, the line slowly disappeared. Jungkook stopped sleeping unless Jimin was nearby. Jimin stopped eating properly whenever Jungkook avoided him after arguments. Small fights turned into emotional disasters. Silence became punishment. Distance became unbearable. The members noticed it, but nobody knew how serious it had become behind closed doors, especially after the incident in Tokyo. Jimin swallowed hard remembering it. Even now his hands shook. Back in the studio, the host asked quietly, "Tokyo?" Jungkook immediately looked up for the first time since recording started. His expression changed instantly, sharp, nervous, like he didn't want that story mentioned. Jimin saw it. He paused, then gave a tiny nod anyway. "Yeah," he said softly, "Tokyo changed everything." Suddenly, Taehyung shifted uncomfortably in the back of the room. Even he looked stressed hearing that name again. The podcast staff realized something serious had happened there. Jimin continued speaking. Before Tokyo, Jungkook still knew how to hide his emotions. His voice became quieter. After Tokyo, he stopped pretending. Flashback again. Tokyo Hotel. Winter. BTS had just finished a brutal overseas schedule. Everybody was exhausted. The managers were stressed. The members barely slept for days. That night, Jimin accidentally overheard company staff discussing Jungkook privately in the hallway. He's distracted lately. Too emotional. Too attached. The situation with Jimin is becoming noticeable. Jimin remembered freezing behind the corner after hearing that. At first, he thought maybe he misunderstood, but then another sentence destroyed him completely. If this keeps affecting schedules, we may need to separate them for a while. Jimin's chest tightened even remembering it now. Back then, he immediately walked away before they noticed him listening. His mind spiraled instantly. Separate them, force distance between them. Why? Were they really becoming that obvious, that unhealthy? Jimin returned to his hotel room but couldn't calm down. And then Jungkook entered 10 minutes later smiling casually while holding convenience store snacks like nothing was wrong. "I got your favorite drink," Jungkook said. Simple. Normal. Completely unaware of what Jimin had just heard. But suddenly Jimin couldn't even look at him properly anymore, because for the first time he realized everybody around them had already noticed the problem. Jungkook noticed the tension immediately. "What happened?" he asked. Jimin shook his head. "Nothing." Jungkook didn't buy it. "Hyung, I said nothing." The room became silent. Rain tapped softly against the hotel windows while Jungkook slowly set the snacks down. His expression changed from confusion to concern. "Did somebody say something to you?" Jimin looked away. That hesitation alone was enough. Jungkook stood up instantly. "Who?" His voice became colder, dangerous. Jimin hated that tone because Jungkook only sounded like that when he was about to lose control emotionally. "Nobody," Jimin lied again. But Jungkook stepped closer anyway. "Tell me," Jimin snapped first. "Why does it matter so much to you?" Silence. Jungkook froze, completely caught off guard. Jimin immediately regretted it, but exhaustion and fear were already taking over his emotions. "You can't keep acting like this every time something happens to me," Jimin continued. "People are starting to notice." Jungkook's face slowly changed, hurt, confused, then defensive. "What does that mean?" Jimin turned away again. "It means maybe this has gone too far." The second those words left his mouth, Jungkook's expression completely collapsed. And that was the moment everything between them started breaking apart. Back inside the podcast studio, nobody interrupted anymore. The staff were completely absorbed in the story. Jimin rubbed his eyes before continuing. "I shouldn't have said it like that," he admitted quietly. "But at the time, I thought distancing myself from him was the only way to protect him." The host asked carefully, "Protect him from what?" Jimin laughed bitterly. "From me." Jungkook suddenly shifted in his seat again. His eyes looked angry now, not at Jimin, at himself. Jimin noticed it instantly. "See?" he whispered while glancing toward Jungkook. "He still reacts like that." Then Jimin continued the memory. That night in Tokyo turned into the worst argument they'd ever had at the time. Jungkook kept demanding answers while Jimin kept refusing to explain what he overheard. Eventually Jungkook's frustration exploded. "Why are you pushing me away all of a sudden?" he shouted quietly, trying not to alert neighboring rooms. Jimin finally broke too. "Because this isn't normal anymore." Silence hit instantly. Jungkook stared at him like he'd been slapped. Jimin's breathing became shaky. "You think I don't notice?" he continued. "You stop eating when I'm upset. You don't sleep properly unless I'm near you. You look at me like—" He stopped himself too late. Jungkook whispered, "Like what?" Jimin couldn't answer, because the truth terrified him too much. Jungkook stepped closer slowly. "Say it." Jimin clenched his fists. "Like losing me would destroy you." Jungkook didn't deny it. That was the problem. He just stood there silently, eyes glossy, breathing uneven, completely exposed emotionally for the first time. And somehow that silence scared Jimin more than yelling ever could. "Hyung," Jungkook said weakly. But Jimin grabbed his jacket first. This is exactly why people are talking, he whispered desperately. Do you understand how dangerous this is for you? Jungkook's eyes immediately hardened. I don't care. You should. I don't. Jungkook, I said I don't. His voice cracked loudly enough to echo inside the hotel room. Then silence again. Heavy silence. Jungkook turned away immediately after shouting, both hands covering his face like he already regretted losing control. Jimin remembered feeling his heart break seeing that, because underneath all Jungkook's anger was pure fear. Fear of abandonment, fear of losing him, fear that Jimin was already halfway out the door emotionally. Back in the studio present day, one female producer quietly wiped tears from her eyes. Nobody mocked her. The atmosphere had become painfully emotional now. Jimin noticed and gave a sad smile. That wasn't even the worst part, he admitted. Jungkook closed his eyes immediately after hearing that sentence, like he already knew what memory was coming next. Jimin continued, after that argument, I really tried leaving him. The room froze again, and somewhere deep inside the studio, even the staff realized the story was only beginning. The studio air felt colder now. Nobody touched their phones anymore. Nobody whispered behind the cameras. Even the sound engineer stopped moving around. Jimin's story had pulled everybody into a place that felt too personal to interrupt. He leaned back slowly in his chair, but his eyes stayed locked on the floor like he was still trapped inside that Tokyo hotel room from years ago. Jungkook sat beside him, completely silent, fingers tightly clasped together. Every time Jimin revealed another part of the story, Jungkook's breathing visibly changed. It was obvious he remembered every second too. Jimin swallowed once before continuing. After the argument, he said quietly, I started avoiding him completely. The host frowned carefully. Immediately? Jimin nodded. The next morning. Flashback, Tokyo hotel breakfast area, early morning, barely any sleep. BTS members sat around the table eating quietly while managers discussed schedules nearby. Normally Jungkook sat beside Jimin automatically without even thinking about it. Everybody knew that. It had become natural over the years, but that morning Jimin purposely sat on the opposite side beside Namjoon before Jungkook arrived. The second Jungkook walked into the room, he stopped. Completely stopped. His eyes immediately searched for Jimin out of instinct. Then he noticed the empty chair beside Taehyung instead. The atmosphere shifted instantly. Nobody said anything at first. Jungkook slowly sat down, but his expression became unreadable. Jimin forced himself not to look at him. Taehyung noticed the tension immediately. Hoseok too. Jin kept glancing between them while pretending to eat. Namjoon already looked tired before the day even started. Then Jungkook quietly asked, Did I do something wrong? Nobody moved. Jimin kept staring at his coffee. No, he answered flatly. Jungkook frowned harder. Then why are you acting like this? Jimin didn't answer. He just stood up suddenly and left the table before anybody could stop him. Behind him, the chair scraped loudly against the floor. Jungkook almost followed immediately, but Namjoon grabbed his wrist under the table. Not now, RM whispered carefully. Jungkook looked furious, hurt, confused. Hyung, give him space. Jungkook pulled his hand away anyway. Why? Nobody had an answer because honestly, even the members didn't fully understand what was happening yet. They only knew the atmosphere between Jimin and Jungkook had become dangerously unstable overnight. Back in the present, Jimin rubbed his face slowly. I thought if I kept distance long enough, things would calm down. He laughed weakly again. Instead, everything got worse. The host asked softly, How bad? Jimin finally looked up. His eyes looked exhausted just remembering it. Jungkook stopped sleeping. Silence filled the studio again. Jungkook looked away immediately. Jimin continued anyway. At first I didn't know, he admitted, because he hid it well during schedules. Flashback again. Tokyo concert rehearsal, bright stage lights, loud music, staff running everywhere. Jungkook acted completely normal around everybody else, smiling for cameras, practicing choreography, joking with the members occasionally. But Jimin noticed small things nobody else saw. Jungkook's hands shaking slightly during water breaks. Dark circles under his eyes getting worse every day. Moments where he stared blankly into space before forcing himself back into focus. Jimin tried ignoring it. He told himself this was necessary, healthy, temporary. But every time he pulled away, Jungkook somehow looked more destroyed. Then came the third night, the moment Jimin realized things had gone too far already. Around 3 in the morning, Jimin woke up thirsty inside the hotel dorm. Everybody else seemed asleep. He quietly walked toward the kitchen area expecting silence. Instead, he found Jungkook sitting alone on the floor in darkness. No lights, no phone, no TV, just sitting there motionless against the wall. Jimin froze immediately. Jungkook looked terrible, pale, exhausted, eyes red from lack of sleep. For a second, neither of them spoke. Then Jungkook quietly said, "You really hate me now." Jimin's chest tightened painfully. "What?" Jungkook laughed softly, but it sounded broken. "You haven't looked at me properly in 3 days?" Jimin tried staying emotionally distant. "You're overthinking." "Am I?" Jungkook looked up slowly. "Then why does it feel like you disappeared?" The silence afterward hurt more than yelling ever could. Jimin remembered standing there unable to move because part of him wanted to run straight back to Jungkook immediately. But another part kept remembering the company staff conversation. Too attached, too emotional. Separate them. Dangerous. Jimin forced himself to stay cold. "We were getting unhealthy," he whispered. Jungkook stared at him in disbelief. "Unhealthy?" Jimin nodded weakly. "You depended on me too much." Jungkook's expression changed instantly after hearing that sentence. Something inside him snapped quietly. "You think I don't know that?" he asked. Jimin froze. Jungkook stood up slowly from the floor. "You think I wanted this?" His voice cracked again. "I tried fixing it too." Jimin couldn't breathe properly anymore. Jungkook kept talking before he could respond. "Do you know how exhausting it is?" he whispered. "Every time you're upset, I panic. Every time you avoid me, I can't think straight. Every time somebody criticizes you online, I want to destroy something." The words hit harder than Jimin expected because Jungkook wasn't denying anything anymore. He was confessing it openly. And somehow that honesty terrified Jimin even more. "Jungkook." "But I still stayed." Jungkook continued quietly, "because being around you was the only thing that made all this pressure survivable." Jimin's eyes immediately filled with tears hearing that. The pressure, the schedules, the loneliness, the fear. BTS were global stars already, but behind the cameras they were exhausted young men breaking apart mentally under non-stop expectations. And somewhere during that chaos, Jungkook had started clinging to Jimin emotionally like a lifeline. Jimin understood it. That was exactly why he felt guilty. "You shouldn't need me that much," Jimin whispered. Jungkook immediately answered, "Too late." Back in the podcast studio, even the host looked emotional now. One staff member behind the monitor quietly muttered, "Oh my God," before covering her mouth. Jimin noticed the reaction and sighed heavily. "That's when I realized something," he said. Jungkook already knew he was falling apart. Jungkook's jaw tightened again beside him. He still hadn't interrupted once, but the tension around him was becoming unbearable. Jimin continued carefully. "And the worst thing?" He paused. "I still left him anyway." The room instantly became silent again. Flashback, final Tokyo schedule night, rainstorm outside, managers rushing everyone back to the hotel after rehearsals. The members were exhausted. Jimin spent the entire ride back staring out the van window while replaying Jungkook's words in his head. Too late. The sentence wouldn't leave him alone. By the time they returned to the hotel, Jimin had already made his decision. He needed distance immediately before things became even more emotionally dangerous between them. So while the members showered and prepared for bed, Jimin quietly packed a bag alone. Not permanently, just enough to move into another room temporarily. At least that's what he told himself. But deep down he knew this would crush Jungkook completely. The guilt almost stopped him several times. Then came the knock on the door. Jungkook entered casually, holding 2 drinks. "I got you." He stopped instantly after seeing the packed bag. Silence. Pure silence. Jimin remembered his heart practically collapsing in that moment. Jungkook slowly looked from the bag to Jimin's face. "What is this?" he asked quietly. Jimin couldn't answer immediately. Jungkook stepped closer. "Hyung." His voice already sounded afraid. Jimin forced himself to speak. I'm changing rooms for a while. Jungkook froze completely. What? It's temporary. Why? Jimin looked away. I think we need space. Jungkook stared at him like the world suddenly stopped making sense. You're serious? Jimin nodded once. That tiny movement destroyed Jungkook instantly. He set the drinks down too hard on the table. One nearly fell over. Because of what I said, he whispered. Jungkook, because I admitted I needed you. His voice became shaky now, angry and desperate at the same time. So now you're leaving? Jimin tried staying calm, but his chest already hurt too much. I'm trying to help you. Jungkook laughed bitterly. No. He shook his head slowly. You're trying to punish me. That's not true. Then look at me and say you actually want to leave. Jimin couldn't do it, and Jungkook noticed immediately. That hesitation completely shattered whatever control he had left emotionally. Please, Jungkook whispered suddenly. Quiet, broken, vulnerable in a way almost nobody had ever seen before. Don't go tonight. Jimin felt tears burn his eyes instantly. Because Jungkook almost never begged. Not like this, not openly, but Jimin still believed leaving was necessary, even if it hurt both of them. He grabbed the bag anyway, and that was the exact moment Jungkook's fear finally turned into something much worse. The podcast studio had become so quiet that even the faint hum from the air conditioner sounded loud. Nobody expected the story to become this raw. One of the assistant producers stopped taking notes completely and just stared at Jimin with watery eyes. Jungkook still hadn't spoken once since the recording began, but the tension around him was impossible to ignore now. His shoulders were stiff, his jaw locked tightly, like every memory Jimin mentioned was dragging him back into a version of himself he hated remembering. Jimin exhaled slowly before continuing. That night, he whispered, I saw Jungkook panic for the first time. Flashback, Tokyo hotel room, rain crashing violently against the windows. Jimin's hand tightened around the bag strap while Jungkook stood directly between him and the door now, not aggressively, not threatening, just desperate. Completely desperate. Please don't leave tonight, Jungkook repeated quietly. His voice sounded unstable now. Jimin hated hearing it. We're both exhausted, Jimin tried explaining. We need time apart to think clearly. Jungkook shook his head immediately. No, you already decided everything alone. Jimin looked away again. Because somebody had to. That sentence hit harder than intended. Jungkook's expression changed instantly. Hurt first, then anger. So now I'm the problem? He asked quietly. Jimin stayed silent too long. Jungkook laughed once under his breath. Empty, bitter. Wow, Jimin finally answered. That's not what I said, but it's what you meant. The silence afterward became unbearable. Jimin remembered wanting to hug him right there, apologize, cancel everything, but the fear inside him kept winning. Fear that the company was right, fear that Jungkook was emotionally collapsing because of him, fear that someday the public would notice too. BTS already lived under impossible pressure. One scandal, one emotional breakdown. One rumor at the wrong time could destroy years of work. Jimin thought distancing himself now would save Jungkook later, but he completely underestimated how deeply Jungkook depended on him emotionally already. Jungkook stepped closer slowly. Tell me the truth, he whispered. Did somebody say something? Jimin froze. That hesitation answered everything. Jungkook's eyes darkened immediately. Who? It doesn't matter. Who? Jungkook, stop! Tell me! His voice cracked loudly enough to echo across the room, then silence again. Jungkook turned away immediately afterward, breathing hard like he was trying to control himself before completely exploding emotionally. Jimin had never seen him this unstable before, not even during their worst trainee years. Jungkook suddenly grabbed the edge of the kitchen counter with both hands, head lowered. They think I'm weak now? He asked quietly. Jimin's throat tightened. Nobody said that. Jungkook laughed again. You don't suddenly leave somebody unless people started talking. Jimin couldn't deny it anymore. That was enough. Jungkook slowly nodded to himself while staring at the floor. I knew it, he whispered. I knew people noticed. Jimin took a step toward him carefully. Jungkook, How bad is it? Jungkook interrupted. Do the members know too? Jimin hesitated again. Wrong move. Jungkook's expression completely collapsed. They do, he whispered. Don't they? Back in the studio present day, Namjoon quietly covered his eyes with one hand while listening. Taehyung looked emotionally exhausted already. Hoseok stared at the floor without moving. The podcast host looked genuinely nervous continuing this interview now, but Jimin kept going anyway. The truth, he admitted softly, the members noticed long before we did. Flashback again, months before Tokyo, BTS dorm practice room around midnight. The members had just finished rehearsals, but Jungkook and Jimin were still arguing quietly in the corner while everyone packed up. Nobody could hear exact words, but the tension between them was obvious. Eventually, Jungkook walked out first, looking angry while Jimin stayed behind pretending to check his phone. Then, Taehyung casually sat beside him. You guys fought again? Jimin immediately denied it. No? Taehyung gave him a look. Jimin? Silence. Then Taehyung sighed softly. You know he follows you around like a lost puppy now, right? Jimin forced a laugh. That's dramatic. I'm serious. Taehyung's voice became quieter. And honestly, it's starting to scare the members a little. Jimin remembered freezing after hearing that. Taehyung noticed immediately. I'm not saying he's crazy, Taehyung clarified quickly. It's just... He struggled finding the right words. Jungkook gets really bad whenever something happens between you two. Jimin's stomach dropped. What do you mean? Taehyung looked uncomfortable now. When you ignored him after that Busan argument, he stayed awake almost 2 days. Jimin stared at him in shock. What? Namjoon Hyung found him sitting alone in the gym at 5 in the morning. Taehyung paused carefully. And when you got injured during rehearsals last year, Jungkook punched a wall hard enough to split his hand open. Jimin couldn't process it properly. Nobody told him any of this before. Taehyung continued quietly. We didn't want to interfere because we thought you guys would fix it yourselves. Then his expression became more serious. But Jimin, I think Jungkook's emotional state depends on you way more than you realize. Back in the Tokyo hotel room present timeline, Jimin finally understood Taehyung had been right all along. Jungkook wasn't just upset about distance, he was terrified. Completely terrified. Jungkook slowly sat down on the edge of the bed now, both hands covering his face again. I tried not making it obvious, he whispered weakly. Jimin's heart broke hearing that sentence. Because Jungkook sounded ashamed of how emotionally dependent he had become. You don't understand? Jungkook continued quietly. When things get bad, you're the only person that makes my head calm down. Jimin immediately looked away because tears were already forming again. Jungkook kept talking anyway. When I'm angry, I look for you first. When I'm exhausted, I look for you first. Even when something good happens, he laughed painfully, I still look for you first. Jimin couldn't breathe properly anymore because deep down he did the exact same thing. That was the real problem. Their emotional attachment had stopped being balanced a long time ago. But unlike Jungkook, Jimin hid it better. Or at least he thought he did. Jungkook suddenly looked up again, eyes red now, vulnerable. Was I really that unbearable? He asked quietly. Jimin immediately shook his head. No. Then why does this feel like you're abandoning me? The word abandoning hit like a knife. Jimin remembered physically flinching hearing it, because somewhere deep down, Jungkook wasn't completely wrong. Jimin sat beside him carefully now, keeping distance but still close enough to hear Jungkook's uneven breathing. I'm doing this because I care about you, Jimin whispered. Jungkook immediately answered, then stay. Silence. Jimin closed his eyes. I can't. That was the moment Jungkook finally broke emotionally. Not loudly, not dramatically. Worse, he just stopped speaking completely. All expression disappeared from his face. He stood up slowly without looking at Jimin anymore. Then he quietly walked toward the door. Jimin panicked immediately. Jungkook. No answer. Jungkook, wait. Jungkook stopped near the doorway, still facing away. His voice came out barely above a whisper. If you leave tonight, he paused, breathing uneven again. I don't know what I'll do. Jimin froze instantly. Back in the present-day studio, even the staff looked alarmed hearing that line. The host leaned forward carefully. Was he threatening something? Jimin shook his head immediately. No. His voice became firm for the first time. That's important. Jungkook never threatened me. He swallowed hard. He was scared of himself. Jungkook beside him finally spoke for the first time since the interview began. Quiet, rough. I really was. The entire room looked at him instantly. Jungkook stared at the floor while speaking slowly. Back then, I genuinely thought if Jimin disappeared from my life, I'd completely lose control mentally. Silence swallowed the studio whole. Nobody expected Jungkook to finally admit it himself. Jimin looked at him softly but didn't interrupt. Jungkook continued quietly, and honestly, he laughed bitterly. I hated myself for it. That confession hit the room harder than anyone expected. Because suddenly this wasn't just a dramatic relationship story anymore. It was about emotional survival, about fear, about two exhausted people carrying too much pressure for too long without realizing how badly they were breaking each other in the process. Jimin slowly nodded after Jungkook finished speaking. That night in Tokyo, he whispered, was the first time I realized Jungkook might actually fall apart if I disappeared. The host asked carefully, So what did you do? Jimin looked down again. Long pause. Then he answered softly, I still walked out. And the second he said that, Jungkook closed his eyes like he could still hear the hotel door shutting all over again. The silence inside the studio became unbearable after Jimin admitted he still walked away. Nobody moved for several seconds. Even the cameras felt intrusive now, like they were recording something they were never supposed to witness. Jungkook kept his eyes closed, breathing slowly through his nose as if forcing himself not to get dragged completely back into that night again. Jimin sat motionless beside him, fingers trembling lightly against the microphone. Then the host finally asked a question everybody in the room was thinking. What happened after you left? Jimin looked up slowly. His expression changed immediately. Guilt. Pure guilt. That, he whispered, was the worst night of my life. Flashback, Tokyo, rainstorm, hotel hallway. Jimin remembered the sound of the door shutting behind him, feeling louder than any scream. He stood outside Jungkook's room, holding the bag tightly while his entire body begged him to go back inside. But he forced himself forward anyway, one step. Then another. Every second felt wrong. The hallway lights were dim. The rain outside shook the windows. Jimin's chest hurt so badly he could barely breathe properly anymore, but he kept walking, because in his mind this was the only way to stop things from becoming worse later. He reached the elevator, pressed the button, waited in silence. Then suddenly, footsteps, fast. Behind him, Jimin turned around just in time to see Jungkook running down the hallway barefoot. No jacket, no umbrella, no phone. His eyes looked terrified. Completely terrified. Hyung! The elevator doors opened behind Jimin, but he didn't move. Jungkook stopped a few feet away, breathing hard. Rain thunder echoed through the building while both of them stared at each other in silence. Jungkook's voice came out shaking. Please don't do this. Jimin felt his heart crack instantly. He had never seen Jungkook look this emotionally destroyed before. Not after injuries, not after scandals. Not even during the hardest trainee years. Jungkook looked like somebody watching their entire world disappear in real time. It's temporary, Jimin whispered again weakly. Jungkook immediately shook his head. No. His breathing became uneven again. No, because if you leave now, everything changes. Jimin tried staying calm. That's the point. Jungkook stared at him in disbelief. You really think leaving me alone right now is helping? Jimin opened his mouth but couldn't answer. Because honestly, no. Deep down, he already knew this was hurting Jungkook far worse than he predicted. But before he could say anything else, Jungkook suddenly stepped closer. Did you ever think about what happens to me after you walk away? The question hit hard. Jimin whispered carefully, You'll be okay. Jungkook laughed painfully. Don't lie to me. Silence again. Then Jungkook's eyes filled with tears for the first time. Real tears, not hidden, not turned away from, completely exposed. You know I won't be. Back in the podcast studio, one of the camera staff quietly lowered his head after hearing that line. Nobody expected Jungkook's emotional state back then to have been this serious. Jimin rubbed his hands together slowly before continuing. That was the first time Jungkook cried in front of me because of me. Jungkook gave a weak smile beside him. I was pathetic. Jimin immediately shook his head. No, his voice cracked slightly. You were scared. Jungkook looked down again after hearing that. Flashback continued. The elevator doors behind Jimin finally closed again after being ignored too long. Neither of them noticed. Jungkook stood there silently now, tears mixing with exhaustion while trying desperately to hold himself together emotionally. Jimin wanted to hug him so badly it physically hurt, but fear still controlled him. Fear that staying would only make things worse long term. Jungkook wiped his face roughly before speaking again. Just tell me one thing honestly. Jimin nodded slowly. Jungkook's voice almost broke completely. Did you ever actually want me around the same way I wanted you around? Jimin froze instantly, because that question terrified him more than anything else. Not because the answer was no, but because the answer was yes. Too much yes. That was exactly why he was trying to leave. Jimin remembered looking away immediately. Wrong move again. Jungkook noticed, and something inside him completely shattered. Wow, he whispered, you can't even answer. Jungkook, I get it. His voice suddenly became cold in the saddest way possible. Not angry anymore, just defeated. I get it now. Then he turned around slowly and walked away down the hallway. Jimin panicked instantly. Jungkook, no response. Jungkook kept walking barefoot toward the emergency stairwell. Jimin's instincts immediately screamed something was wrong, very wrong. Jungkook, wait! But Jungkook disappeared through the stairwell door without looking back once. Jimin dropped the bag immediately and ran after him. The stairwell echoed with footsteps and rain sounds from outside vents, while Jimin rushed downward searching for him. Jungkook! Nothing, just silence. Floor after floor, empty. Then finally, ground-level exit door wide open. Rain pouring violently outside. Jimin's stomach dropped instantly. He ran into the storm without thinking. Cold rain soaked him immediately. The streets outside the hotel were nearly empty because of the late hour and weather. Jimin spun around desperately searching through the darkness. Then he saw him. Jungkook walking down the street alone in the rain wearing only thin sweatpants and a black shirt. No umbrella, no destination, just walking aimlessly like he didn't care anymore. Jungkook. Jimin chased after him immediately. Jungkook kept walking anyway. Faster now, Jimin finally caught his arm near a closed convenience store. Stop! Jungkook yanked his arm away hard enough to shock Jimin. Why? Jungkook shouted over the rain. So you can leave again? Jimin stared at him speechless. Jungkook's entire body was shaking now. From cold, exhaustion, emotion, maybe all three. You said you needed space, Jungkook laughed bitterly. So here. He spread his arms slightly in the rain. Take all the space you want. Jimin's heart felt like it was being ripped apart watching him spiral like this. You're not thinking clearly, Jimin whispered. Jungkook snapped immediately. Of course I'm not thinking clearly. His voice echoed through the empty street. I haven't slept properly in days because every time I close my eyes, I think you're gonna disappear. Silence hit instantly afterward. Jungkook looked horrified hearing his own words out loud. Jimin froze completely too, because suddenly everything became terrifyingly real. This wasn't normal heartbreak anymore. Jungkook was mentally collapsing right in front of him. Jungkook covered his face immediately after yelling. Forget it, he muttered weakly. Forget I said that. Then he turned away again, but this time Jimin grabbed him before he could leave. Tight, desperate. Stop walking away from me, Jimin whispered. Jungkook laughed shakily without looking back. Funny. Jimin ignored it. You're freezing. I don't care. Jungkook, you left first. The scream broke something between them completely. Jungkook turned around again, tears mixing with rainwater now. You keep saying this is for me. he shouted weakly. "But you never asked what I wanted." Jimin couldn't answer because Jungkook was right. Completely right. Jungkook stepped closer suddenly, eyes red and exhausted and terrified all at once. "You want to know the truth?" he whispered. "I was already drowning before Tokyo." Jimin's breathing stopped. Jungkook continued quietly. "The pressure, the hate, the expectations." His voice cracked. "Every day felt heavier." Another step closer. "And you were the only thing making it survivable?" Jimin felt tears streaming down his own face now too. Jungkook looked completely broken standing there in the rain. "So, when you walked out tonight," he laughed painfully again. "It felt like losing oxygen." Back in the present-day studio, nobody could even pretend not to be emotional anymore. Several staff members were crying openly now. Even the host looked close to tears. Jimin's eyes were glossy too while remembering it. "That was the moment I realized I misunderstood everything," he whispered. "Jungkook wasn't obsessed with me." He paused, voice shaking. He was trying to survive. Jungkook finally looked at Jimin directly for the first time since the interview started. The emotion between them instantly changed the atmosphere of the entire room. Heavy, honest, old wounds reopening in real time. Then Jimin quietly revealed the part nobody in the studio was prepared for. But what terrified me most, he swallowed hard, was what Jungkook admitted next. The host whispered carefully, "What did he say?" Jimin looked down slowly. Long silence. Then finally, "He told me he almost quit BTS because he thought losing me would destroy him anyway." The entire studio froze after that confession. Nobody even reacted immediately because the sentence felt too heavy to process. Jungkook almost quit BTS. Not because of scandals, not because of exhaustion, not because of injuries, because he thought losing Jimin would destroy him mentally anyway. The podcast host looked completely stunned. One of the editors behind the cameras quietly whispered, "No way," under his breath before covering his mouth. Namjoon leaned back in his chair with his eyes closed like he had been carrying this memory for years too. Jimin sat perfectly still while the silence swallowed the room whole. Then the host finally asked softly, "He actually said that?" Jimin nodded once, slowly, in the rain. Flashback, Tokyo streets. Around 4 in the morning. Cold rain crashing against empty sidewalks while Jimin and Jungkook stood face to face under flickering streetlights, both soaked completely, both emotionally shattered already. Jungkook's chest rose unevenly while he tried forcing himself to stay calm, but it was obvious he was barely holding together anymore. Jimin remembered staring at him in disbelief after hearing those words. "Quit BTS?" he whispered. Jungkook immediately looked away like he regretted saying it out loud. But it was too late now. Jimin grabbed his arm tighter. "You were seriously thinking that?" Jungkook stayed silent. Wrong answer. Jimin's panic immediately exploded. "Jungkook!" Jungkook finally answered quietly. "I didn't know how to keep going." The rain drowned out the street around them, but Jimin still heard every word clearly. Jungkook laughed weakly to himself. "I know how insane that sounds." "It does sound insane," Jimin shouted back immediately. "Do you hear yourself right now?" Jungkook nodded slowly. "Every day." The exhaustion in his voice hurt worse than anger ever could. Jimin suddenly realized something terrifying. Jungkook hadn't been hiding these emotions because he wanted attention. He hid them because he genuinely thought something was wrong with him. "How long?" Jimin asked quietly. Jungkook hesitated. "Since last year." Jimin felt sick instantly. Last year? That meant Jungkook had been silently struggling emotionally for over a year while pretending everything was normal around the members, cameras, managers, and fans. Jimin's mind started replaying old memories differently now. Jungkook staring at him too long during rehearsals. Jungkook becoming unusually quiet whenever Jimin got injured or sick. Jungkook getting angry during small misunderstandings. Jungkook constantly checking if Jimin ate properly. None of it had been random. Jungkook wasn't just protective anymore. He was emotionally depending on Jimin to stabilize himself mentally, and nobody stopped it because BTS were always emotionally close already. The line disappeared slowly enough that nobody realized how dangerous things became until Tokyo finally broke everything open. Jimin whispered carefully, "Why didn't you tell me?" Jungkook looked almost offended hearing that. "How could I?" Jimin froze. Jungkook stepped back slightly in the rain. "You already looked overwhelmed just finding out part of it." His voice cracked again. "If I told you the full truth earlier, you probably would have left me sooner." That sentence destroyed Jimin instantly because deep down, Jungkook wasn't wrong. Back in the studio present day, Jimin wiped his eyes roughly before continuing. "I hated myself after hearing that." The host asked quietly, "Because you walked away?" Jimin shook his head slowly. "Because part of me already knew." Silence. Jungkook looked toward him immediately after hearing that confession. Jimin kept speaking anyway. "I knew Jungkook relied on me emotionally." He swallowed hard. "I just kept pretending it wasn't that serious because I was scared of what it meant." Flashback again. Tokyo streets. Rainstorm. Jungkook stood motionless now while cars passed occasionally through wet roads nearby. His face looked exhausted beyond words. Jimin slowly stepped closer again, voice softer now. "You should have told somebody." Jungkook laughed weakly. "And say what exactly?" He looked directly at Jimin. "That I panic every time you pull away from me?" Jimin opened his mouth but nothing came out. Jungkook continued quietly. "That sometimes I can't sleep unless I know you're okay?" Another step closer. "That when schedules become unbearable, you're the only person that makes me feel human again." Jimin's eyes filled instantly. Jungkook looked miserable, admitting it all out loud, ashamed, vulnerable, scared. "That's not healthy," Jimin whispered weakly. Jungkook nodded immediately. "I know." Then finally, for the first time all night, Jungkook looked angry at himself instead of Jimin. "You think I wanted this?" he asked quietly. "You think I enjoy feeling weak all the time?" Jimin froze again because Jungkook genuinely sounded disgusted with himself. Jungkook ran both hands through his soaked hair roughly before continuing. "I kept trying to fix it alone." His breathing became uneven again. "I tried pulling away too. I tried acting normal. I tried pretending I didn't care where you were all the time." He laughed bitterly. None of it worked. Jimin remembered realizing something painful right there. Jungkook had been fighting himself privately for months, while Jimin stayed completely unaware of how bad things were becoming internally. And the scariest part, Jimin couldn't even fully blame him because his own emotional attachment to Jungkook wasn't exactly normal either. He just hid it better, or maybe he lied to himself better. Back in the studio, the host carefully asked, "Did the other members know Jungkook was struggling this badly?" Jimin hesitated. Then Namjoon suddenly answered instead. "Not fully." Everyone looked toward him immediately. RM sighed heavily before continuing. "We knew something was wrong." His voice sounded tired remembering it. "But Jungkook became very good at pretending around us." Jungkook gave a tiny bitter smile hearing that. Namjoon continued. "The problem was, every time Jimin got distant, Jungkook changed completely." Flashback, BTS practice building, months before Tokyo late-night dance rehearsal. The members were exhausted after hours of practicing the same choreography repeatedly. Jimin had accidentally snapped at Jungkook earlier during rehearsal because of stress and embarrassment after missing a move several times. It wasn't even a serious fight, but afterward Jungkook became unusually quiet for the rest of the night. At first nobody thought much of it. Then things got strange. Jungkook stopped joking completely, stopped eating during break, stopped speaking unless directly asked questions. By midnight, the atmosphere around him felt so tense even the staff noticed. Hoseok eventually pulled Namjoon aside quietly. Did they fight? Namjoon glanced toward Jungkook sitting alone in the corner staring at the floor. Looks like it. Then Taehyung walked over toward Jungkook carefully. "Hey!" No response. "You okay?" Jungkook nodded once without looking up. Obvious lie. Taehyung sighed. "Just talk to Jimin later." Jungkook finally answered quietly, "He's annoyed with me." Taehyung blinked. So, Jungkook laughed softly without humor. You don't get it. Back then, Taehyung didn't understand what that sentence really meant yet. None of them did. But Namjoon noticed something else that night. Around 1 in the morning, Jimin finally approached Jungkook first to apologize casually before leaving rehearsal. The second Jungkook realized Jimin wasn't angry anymore, his entire mood changed immediately, instantly. He smiled again, ate food, finally started talking normally. Even the staff noticed how fast the emotional shift happened. That was the first moment Namjoon genuinely became worried. Back in the studio present, RM spoke quietly. It was like Jungkook's emotional state depended entirely on whether Jimin was okay with him or not. Silence followed immediately after that sentence, because nobody in the room could deny how serious that sounded anymore. Jungkook stared at the floor while listening to his own behavior being described out loud. Jimin looked emotionally exhausted too. The host finally whispered carefully, "Did anyone try stopping it?" Namjoon laughed bitterly. "That's the problem." He looked toward Jimin and Jungkook. "We didn't realize how deep it really went until Tokyo." Jimin nodded slowly. "Tokyo forced everything into the open." Flashback again. Rainy Tokyo Street. Jungkook stood in front of Jimin completely soaked and emotionally exposed now. No hiding anymore. No pretending. Just raw honesty spilling out after months of silent pressure. Then Jungkook quietly admitted something else that changed everything. "There's another reason I panicked tonight." Jimin frowned immediately. "What do you mean?" Jungkook hesitated too long. His breathing became uneven again. "Because," he looked away, "somebody already tried separating us before." Jimin froze instantly. The rain suddenly felt ice cold against his skin. "What?" Jungkook slowly looked back at him, eyes exhausted, "and it almost destroyed me." The studio erupted into whispers immediately after that sentence. Not loud, just shocked reactions spreading behind the cameras like people forgot they were supposed to stay invisible during recording. Even the podcast host looked completely blindsided now. "Wait," he said carefully, "someone actually tried separating you two before Tokyo?" Jimin slowly looked toward Jungkook. Jungkook stayed silent for several seconds before finally nodding once. His expression looked distant now, like the memory physically exhausted him. Jimin leaned back in his chair and exhaled slowly. "That's the part nobody outside BTS ever knew," he admitted quietly, because the company buried it immediately. The room instantly went silent again. Flashback. Seoul. Nearly a year before Tokyo, BTS had just entered one of the busiest periods of their career. Endless overseas promotions, back-to-back concerts, media pressure, online rumors. The members barely had time to sleep properly anymore. But underneath all the schedules, another issue had quietly started attracting attention inside the company. Jimin and Jungkook. Specifically how emotionally inseparable they had become. It started small. Managers noticing Jungkook refusing schedule changes if it separated him too long from Jimin. Staff noticing Jimin getting unusually anxious whenever Jungkook disappeared during breaks. Tiny details, nothing dramatic individually, but together it became impossible not to notice. Then came the incident during overseas filming. BTS were shooting content late at night when Jimin suddenly collapsed from exhaustion backstage. Not serious, just severe fatigue mixed with dehydration. The staff reacted quickly. Medics arrived. Managers handled everything professionally. But Jungkook completely lost control emotionally. Jimin remembered it clearly now. The second Jimin hit the floor, Jungkook pushed past staff so aggressively one security guard actually grabbed him, thinking something dangerous was happening. "Move!" Jungkook shouted. Nobody had ever heard him sound like that before. His face looked terrified, completely terrified. Jimin was barely conscious at the time, but he still remembered Jungkook kneeling beside him with shaking hands while repeatedly saying his name over and over. "Jimin Hyung, look at me." The staff eventually stabilized the situation quickly, but Jungkook stayed beside Jimin the entire night afterward. Refused to leave, refused to sleep, refused to calm down. That was the moment management officially became concerned. Back in the present-day studio, Jimin rubbed his forehead slowly. After that incident, he whispered, the company started watching us more carefully. The host frowned. Watching? Namjoon answered this time. Not in a malicious way, RM clarified carefully. They were worried about both of them mentally. Jungkook laughed quietly under his breath. Especially me. Nobody denied it. Flashback again. Company meeting room, weeks after Jimin collapsed backstage. Jungkook sat across from two senior managers while one performance director quietly reviewed scheduled papers nearby. The atmosphere already felt tense before anyone spoke. Jungkook remembered immediately realizing something was wrong because nobody would look him directly in the eyes. Then one manager carefully said, "We think you need more emotional independence." Jungkook froze instantly. "What?" Another manager continued gently, "You've been under enormous pressure lately. All of you have. But some staff members are becoming concerned about your emotional reliance on Jimin." Jungkook's jaw tightened immediately. "Who said that?" "That's not important." "It is to me." Silence. The managers exchanged nervous looks before continuing. "This isn't punishment," one explained carefully. "We just think temporary distance might help you mentally reset." Jungkook stared at them in disbelief. Distance? Separate hotel rooms during overseas schedules, different resting arrangements when possible. Less dependence emotionally. Jungkook actually laughed after hearing that. Not because it was funny, because he genuinely couldn't believe what he was hearing. "You think changing rooms fixes that?" he whispered. The managers stayed calm. "We think boundaries would help." That word, boundaries. Jungkook remembered hating it instantly because hearing strangers discuss his emotional connection to Jimin like it was some management problem made him feel humiliated, exposed, broken. "Did Jimin agree to this?" Jungkook asked quietly. The silence answered everything. Jungkook's face immediately lost all color. Back in the studio present day, the podcast host looked stunned. "Jimin knew?" Jimin nodded slowly without looking up. "They talked to me first." Silence exploded across the room again. Jungkook stayed motionless beside him now. Jimin's voice became heavier with guilt. "And at the time," he paused painfully, "I agreed with them." The staff behind the cameras looked completely devastated hearing that. Even Taehyung looked emotionally uncomfortable again, remembering it. Jimin continued quietly. "Not because I wanted distance from Jungkook." His eyes became glossy again. "Because I genuinely thought he was mentally drowning." Flashback, company rooftop, nighttime. Jimin sat alone with one senior manager while city lights flickered below Seoul's skyline. The manager spoke carefully. "We're worried about Jungkook." Jimin immediately asked, "What happened?" The manager sighed heavily. "He's exhausted emotionally." Jimin frowned. "We all are." "This is different." Then came the sentence Jimin never forgot. "Jungkook's emotional stability seems tied directly to you." Jimin remembered his stomach dropping instantly. The manager continued gently. "If you fight, he spirals. If you're upset, he loses focus. If you're hurt, he panics." Jimin stayed silent because deep down, he already knew it was true. The manager leaned forward carefully. "We think temporary boundaries might help both of you." Jimin asked quietly, "What kind of boundaries?" "Less emotional dependency." "How?" The manager hesitated before answering. "Space." Jimin hated that word immediately too, but the worst part? A small part of him agreed, because he'd started noticing it himself already. Jungkook watching him constantly during schedules, Jungkook becoming emotionally unstable after small arguments. Jungkook treating Jimin's moods like survival warnings. It scared Jimin too, not because Jungkook loved him, because Jungkook seemed unable to emotionally regulate himself without him anymore, and that felt dangerous for both of them. So eventually Jimin whispered the sentence he would regret for years afterward. "Maybe you're right." Back in the studio, Jungkook finally spoke again quietly. "That conversation destroyed me." Jimin looked toward him immediately. Jungkook kept staring forward while talking, not because of the company. His voice cracked slightly, because Jimin agreed with them. The guilt on Jimin's face instantly became unbearable to watch. "I thought I was helping you," he whispered. Jungkook nodded once sadly. I know. Then he laughed weakly, but back then it felt like everybody had secretly decided I was the problem. Silence swallowed the room again. Flashback. Same night as the management meeting. Jungkook sat alone inside the dorm gym at nearly 4 in the morning, punching a practice bag until his knuckles split open. Not from anger at Jimin. Worse, anger at himself. He remembered replaying the manager's words over and over. Emotional dependence, boundaries, unhealthy, weakness. Every sentence made him hate himself more, because deep down he already knew they weren't entirely wrong. Jungkook had become emotionally addicted to Jimin's presence without even realizing how bad it got. The worst part, he didn't know how to stop anymore. Then the dorm gym door opened quietly behind him. Namjoon walked in. Jungkook immediately wiped his face roughly and looked away. RM noticed the bloody knuckles instantly. You want to explain that? Jungkook shrugged. Doesn't matter. Namjoon walked closer slowly. Management talked to you too? Jungkook froze. Wrong reaction again. Namjoon sighed heavily. I figured. Silence. Then Jungkook quietly asked the question that had been destroying him all night. Do you think I'm pathetic? Namjoon looked genuinely shocked hearing that. What? Jungkook laughed bitterly without humor. Everyone else clearly does. RM immediately answered firmly. Nobody thinks that. Jungkook finally looked at him, eyes exhausted. Then why does everyone want me away from Jimin? Namjoon paused too long, and that hesitation hurt worse than any answer could have. Back in the present day, Studio RM covered his mouth briefly before speaking again. That was the first time I realized Jungkook wasn't just emotionally attached. He looked toward the floor. He was terrified of abandonment. The host whispered carefully, Did you tell Jimin? Namjoon nodded slowly. Eventually. Jimin immediately continued from there. That conversation with Namjoon Hyung changed everything for me. Flashback, dorm balcony, late night. Namjoon stood beside Jimin while city lights glowed faintly below. The atmosphere felt heavy already before RM finally said it directly. You leaving him suddenly could seriously damage him emotionally. Jimin froze. What? RM sighed deeply. I'm not saying this to pressure you into staying close to him. His voice became quieter. I'm saying Jungkook's mental state is getting worse than any of us realized. Jimin's chest tightened painfully. How bad? Namjoon hesitated, then finally admitted quietly, he asked me if I thought everybody would be happier if he disappeared for a while. Jimin felt the blood drain from his face instantly. What? RM looked exhausted remembering it. I don't think he meant anything dangerous. He paused carefully, but he sounded completely lost. Jimin remembered panicking immediately after hearing that, because suddenly this wasn't just about emotional attachment anymore. Jungkook was drowning mentally and nobody knew how to help him without making things worse. Then Namjoon said the sentence Jimin would never forget. Right now, you're the only thing keeping him steady. Back in the Tokyo rainstorm present timeline, Jimin stared at Jungkook in horror after hearing management had already tried separating them once before. That's why you panicked tonight? He whispered. Jungkook nodded slowly while rain poured around them both. Because the last time people tried pulling us apart, he swallowed hard. I almost stopped recognizing myself. The studio atmosphere felt suffocating now. Nobody expected the story to reach this level of emotional damage. One of the podcast assistants quietly stepped outside the room because she was crying too hard to stay professional anymore. The cameras kept rolling, but even the production crew looked emotionally shaken. Jimin sat silently for a moment after the last sentence, staring at his hands while memories clearly overwhelmed him again. Jungkook leaned forward slightly now, elbows resting on his knees, eyes unfocused like he was somewhere far away mentally. Then the host finally asked the question carefully. What happened after management tried separating you? Jungkook laughed once under his breath. Tired. Empty. I started hiding everything better. Flashback, Seoul dorm. Weeks after the management meetings, Jungkook became terrifyingly good at pretending. That was the first thing the members noticed. Before, his emotions always leaked out naturally. If he was upset with Jimin, everybody could tell immediately. If Jimin ignored him, Jungkook became quiet and restless. If Jimin smiled at him again, his entire mood changed instantly. But after the company intervention, Jungkook started acting normal all the time. Too normal. He smiled more during interviews, talked more around staff, stopped following Jimin everywhere automatically, started sitting farther away during meetings sometimes. On the surface, it looked healthier, more controlled, more mature. Management probably thought the boundaries were working. They were wrong. Because behind the scenes, Jungkook's mental state quietly got worse instead. Jimin remembered noticing it first during a late-night recording session. Around 2 in the morning, most staff had already gone home while the members finished vocals separately. Jimin walked into the studio hallway expecting silence, but he heard music still playing faintly from one room, Jungkook's recording room. Jimin peeked through the small window and froze immediately. Jungkook was sitting alone on the floor in darkness instead of recording, head lowered, earphones still hanging around his neck, completely motionless. Jimin entered carefully. Jungkook? Jungkook looked up immediately and smiled automatically, too quickly. Oh, Hyung. Jimin frowned. Why are you sitting in the dark? Just resting. Lie. Obvious lie. Jimin stepped closer, slowly. Have you slept? Jungkook laughed softly. You sound like Namjoon Hyung now. Jimin ignored the joke. Seriously? Jungkook looked away. Silence answered enough already. Jimin sat beside him carefully. You can talk to me. Jungkook's expression changed instantly after hearing that. Pain flashed across his face so quickly Jimin almost missed it. Then Jungkook whispered something that made Jimin's chest tighten immediately. I thought I wasn't supposed to anymore. Back in the studio present day, Jimin covered his eyes briefly. That sentence still hurts, he admitted quietly. Jungkook looked down again beside him. The host asked softly, because he thought you wanted distance. Jimin nodded slowly. I thought boundaries would help him emotionally stabilize. His voice cracked slightly. Instead, he started emotionally isolating himself. Flashback again. The weeks after management intervention slowly became some of the darkest months inside BTS. Not publicly. Fans noticed nothing. Jungkook still performed perfectly, still smiled on camera, still acted playful during broadcasts. But the members started seeing strange cracks privately. Jungkook stopped sleeping in shared spaces, stopped casually touching people during conversations, stopped asking for help when stressed. He withdrew emotionally from everybody except Jimin, but even with Jimin, he now forced distance artificially. And somehow that looked even more painful than before. Taehyung noticed it first one night inside the dorm kitchen. Jungkook stood quietly making coffee at almost 4 in the morning while staring blankly at nothing. Taehyung walked in half asleep and immediately frowned. Why are you awake again? Jungkook shrugged. Can't sleep. Again? Silence. Then Taehyung carefully asked, You and Jimin okay now? Jungkook smiled instantly. Too instantly. Yeah. Another obvious lie. Taehyung sighed. You know, pretending you're fine is actually worse, right? Jungkook stopped stirring the coffee. Long silence. Then quietly, what if pretending is the only way people stop worrying? Taehyung froze hearing that. Because Jungkook sounded exhausted beyond words. He didn't sound dramatic. He sounded defeated. Taehyung moved closer carefully. Hey. Jungkook kept staring at the coffee cup. If I keep making problems for everyone, he whispered, eventually people get tired of me. Taehyung immediately answered, Nobody's tired of you. Jungkook laughed softly. Management literally had meetings about me. Taehyung didn't know what to say to that because technically, it was true. And Jungkook noticed the hesitation immediately. Back in the present studio, Taehyung finally spoke quietly for the first time in a while. That period scared us. Everyone looked toward him. Taehyung rubbed the back of his neck slowly. Before that, Jungkook was emotional but open. After the meetings, he paused. He became emotionally invisible. Silence followed immediately because everybody understood how dangerous that sounded. Flashback. Another late night, dorm living room. Jimin accidentally woke up around dawn and noticed light coming from the couch area. He walked out quietly expecting maybe Namjoon working again. Instead, he found Jungkook sitting alone under a blanket staring at the TV screen without actually watching it. The television wasn't even on. Jimin frowned immediately. Jungkook. Jungkook looked over calmly. Sorry, did I wake you? Jimin sat beside him carefully. What are you doing? Nothing. Another lie. Jimin stared at him longer now. Jungkook looked exhausted. Dark circles worse than ever. Hands slightly trembling. And for the first time, Jimin realized something horrifying. Jungkook wasn't recovering emotionally after the boundaries. He was deteriorating silently. How long have you been awake? Jimin asked quietly. Jungkook hesitated. Since yesterday morning. Jimin's stomach dropped. What? Jungkook shrugged weakly. It happens sometimes now. Jimin immediately turned toward him fully. Why didn't you tell me? Jungkook laughed softly again. Because every time I struggle, people think it's because of you. The guilt hit Jimin like a punch to the chest. Jungkook finally looked at him directly then, eyes exhausted beyond words. I didn't want you blamed anymore. Jimin remembered feeling something break inside him hearing that, because Jungkook genuinely believed protecting Jimin meant suffering alone emotionally, and nobody around them realized how dangerous that mindset was becoming. Jimin whispered carefully, you shouldn't carry this by yourself. Jungkook immediately answered, neither should you. Silence. Then Jungkook quietly admitted the truth he'd been hiding for weeks. I started making rules for myself. Back in the podcast studio, the host frowned immediately. Rules? Jungkook nodded slowly while staring at the floor. To stop depending on Jimin so much. Jimin's expression tightened painfully. Those rules destroyed him, he said quietly. Flashback again. Dorm room. Jungkook sat alone writing in a small notebook around 3 in the morning. Not lyrics, not music ideas. Rules. Rule 1. Don't look for Jimin first when stressed. Rule 2. Don't sit beside him automatically. Rule 3. Don't message him late at night unless necessary. Rule 4. Learn to calm down alone. Rule 5. Stop making Jimin responsible for your emotions. Jungkook stared at the final rule for a long time after writing it, then finally added another sentence underneath. If you fail, distance yourself immediately. Back in the living room conversation, Jungkook admitted all this quietly while Jimin listened in horror. You made rules for your own emotions? Jimin whispered. Jungkook shrugged weakly. I didn't know what else to do. Jimin grabbed the notebook immediately and flipped through the pages. His chest tightened harder with every line because none of the rules sounded healthy. They sounded desperate, like somebody trying to survive their own mind alone. Jungkook, I know it's stupid. No. Jimin looked at him with tears forming instantly. It's sad. Jungkook froze after hearing that. Jimin kept reading. Some pages showed check marks beside successful days. Other pages had angry scratched out lines where Jungkook failed to keep distance emotionally. One entry simply read, accidentally waited outside Jimin's recording room for 20 minutes again. Pathetic. Another said, heard Jimin coughing in his room. Couldn't sleep afterward. Failed again. Jimin felt physically sick reading them because suddenly he realized Jungkook wasn't obsessing over him selfishly. He was desperately trying to control feelings that terrified him too. Jungkook quietly looked away. See why I didn't want to show you? Jimin closed the notebook slowly. His eyes burned with guilt now. You were suffering this whole time. Jungkook answered softly, so were you. Back in the studio present, Jimin finally admitted something he'd never said publicly before. That notebook changed everything for me. The host leaned forward carefully. Why? Jimin looked toward Jungkook. Long silence. Then quietly, because I realized Jungkook wasn't clinging to me because he was weak. His voice cracked. He was fighting himself every single day trying not to. The entire room went silent again. Jungkook looked emotionally overwhelmed now too. Jimin continued softly. And the worst part? He swallowed hard, even after all those rules. Jungkook still blamed himself every time he needed me. Then he paused, eyes lowering again as another painful memory surfaced. But I still didn't understand how bad things really were yet. The host whispered carefully, "What changed?" Jimin closed his eyes briefly. "The voicemail." And instantly, Jungkook's entire expression darkened like he wished that memory stayed buried forever.
The moment Jimin mentioned the voicemail, Jungkook's entire body tensed visibly. It was immediate, sharp enough that even the podcast staff noticed. Namjoon slowly looked down. Taehyung rubbed his face tiredly. Hoseok quietly muttered, "I still hate that night," under his breath before falling silent again. The host looked around the room carefully now because it was obvious this memory affected everybody differently. Jimin sat frozen for a second after saying the word voicemail, like even now he regretted opening that door publicly. Then he finally spoke again. "That was the night I realized Jungkook wasn't just emotionally struggling anymore." His voice lowered. He was disappearing. Silence swallowed the studio whole. Flashback. Seoul. Winter. Around 1:30 in the morning. BTS had just finished another brutal scheduled day filled with rehearsals, interviews, and meetings. Everybody returned to the dorm exhausted. Jimin remembered barely being able to keep his eyes open while walking inside. The members scattered quietly toward their rooms. Nobody had energy left to talk. Jimin expected Jungkook to follow behind everyone normally like usual, but he didn't. At first, nobody noticed because Jungkook had become emotionally distant for weeks already. Sometimes he stayed behind at the studio longer. Sometimes he disappeared into the gym alone late at night. Sometimes he avoided everyone entirely under the excuse of working on music. But around 2 in the morning, Jimin suddenly woke up feeling uneasy for reasons he couldn't explain. The dorm felt strangely quiet. Too quiet. He checked his phone instinctively. No messages. But then he noticed something strange. One missed voicemail notification. From Jungkook, sent 23 minutes earlier. Jimin frowned immediately because Jungkook almost never sent voice messages, especially not late at night. Something about it felt wrong instantly. He pressed play. Silence at first. Static, faint breathing. Then Jungkook's voice finally came through quietly. "Hi, Young." The tone alone made Jimin sit upright immediately. Jungkook sounded exhausted, empty. "Sorry." Long silence again, then another shaky breath. "I think I'm getting worse." Jimin's chest tightened instantly. The voicemail continued. "I tried following the rules." Weak laugh, broken. "Really tried." Another silence. Then quietly, "But my head doesn't calm down anymore." Jimin remembered his hands starting to shake before the message even finished. Jungkook's breathing sounded uneven now, like he'd been crying earlier and was trying to hide it. "You don't have to call me back." Another pause. His voice cracked suddenly. "I didn't want to disappear without apologizing first." The voicemail ended there. Jimin's blood ran cold instantly. He jumped out of bed so fast he nearly dropped his phone. Back in the studio present day, several staff members looked genuinely horrified hearing the voicemail details. The host whispered carefully, "He said disappear." Jimin nodded slowly. "That word terrified me." Jungkook stayed motionless beside him now, eyes fixed on the floor. Jimin continued quietly. "Because suddenly every conversation before that night started replaying differently in my head." Flashback again. Dorm hallway, 2 in the morning. Jimin sprinted through the apartment immediately searching room by room. Bathroom empty. Gym room empty. Kitchen empty. Jungkook's room empty too. The bed untouched. Jimin's panic exploded instantly. "Jungkook!" His voice echoed through the dorm loud enough to wake everyone immediately. Namjoon rushed out first looking confused. "What happened?" Jimin shoved the phone toward him with trembling hands. "He's gone." RM listened to the voicemail once and immediately lost all color in his face too. Within seconds, the entire dorm woke up. Taehyung searched the practice room downstairs. Hoseok started calling Jungkook repeatedly. Jin checked the garage area. Nobody could find him anywhere. And the scariest part, Jungkook's phone was turned off completely. Jimin remembered barely being able to think properly anymore. Every horrible possibility crashed into his head at once. What if Jungkook was alone somewhere spiraling mentally again? What if he believed everyone truly saw him as a burden? What if the pressure finally broke him completely tonight? Namjoon grabbed Jimin's shoulders firmly. "We'll find him." But even RM sounded afraid now. Then suddenly Taehyung called from downstairs through the dorm entrance. "Hayoung!" Everyone rushed toward him immediately. Taehyung stood near the front lobby holding something small in his hand. Jungkook's notebook, the rule notebook. Jimin's stomach dropped instantly. "Where did you find that?" Taehyung looked pale. "On the bench outside." Jimin grabbed the notebook immediately and opened it with shaking hands. Most pages looked the same as before. Rules, failures, attempts to emotionally distance himself. But near the back, new writing appeared messier than the others, almost unreadable in places. Jimin remembered the exact sentence that made his chest stop working for a second. If staying near Jimin hurts him, maybe disappearing is the only way to protect him. Back in the podcast studio, one of the producers actually covered her face completely after hearing that line. Nobody even tried pretending this was just entertainment anymore. The emotional weight inside the room had become overwhelming. Jimin rubbed his eyes roughly before continuing. That was the moment I realized Jungkook genuinely believed people would be safer without him. Jungkook finally spoke quietly beside him. I wasn't thinking clearly back then. Jimin immediately looked toward him. You were suffering alone. Jungkook laughed weakly. Same thing. Silence again. Flashback, Seoul streets. Nearly 3 a.m. now. Snow falling lightly. BTS managers had joined the search after Namjoon privately explained the situation without revealing too much. Nobody contacted media. Nobody contacted company executives yet. Panic stayed contained inside a tiny circle of exhausted people desperately searching for Jungkook before something terrible happened. Jimin rode in the passenger seat beside Namjoon, barely breathing properly anymore while repeatedly replaying the voicemail in his head. I didn't want to disappear without apologizing first. The sentence felt like a knife every single time. Then suddenly Jimin remembered something. The bridge. Namjoon looked over instantly. What? Jimin's chest tightened harder. Whenever Jungkook gets overwhelmed mentally, he swallowed hard. He goes near the river. RM immediately turned the car without another word. 15 minutes later, they arrived near the Han River pedestrian area. Snow mixed with freezing rain now while empty streets stretched around them in silence. Jimin jumped out before the car fully stopped. Jungkook! No answer, just cold wind. Then finally Taehyung shouted from farther ahead. There! Jimin ran immediately, and there Jungkook was, sitting alone near the railing overlooking the dark river water below, hood up, arms wrapped around himself, completely motionless. Jimin remembered almost collapsing from relief and terror at the same time. Jungkook looked up slowly, hearing footsteps approach. His expression immediately changed when he saw Jimin. Not surprise, worse, guilt. Hayoung! Jimin reached him first and grabbed his jacket hard enough to shake him slightly. What the hell are you doing? Jungkook looked stunned by the panic in Jimin's voice. I just needed air. Your phone was off, Jimin shouted. You left that voicemail and disappeared. Jungkook froze completely after hearing himself described out loud like that. Namjoon and Taehyung stopped several feet away, giving them space while still watching carefully. Jimin's breathing became uneven now too. Do you understand how scared we were? Jungkook immediately looked down. Shame flooded his face instantly. Sorry. Stop apologizing, Jimin snapped. Jungkook flinched slightly. And the second Jimin saw that reaction, his anger collapsed into guilt immediately. Because Jungkook genuinely looked broken, not rebellious, not dramatic, just exhausted beyond emotional survival. Jimin's voice lowered shakily. Why didn't you call me directly? Long silence. Then Jungkook quietly answered, because I thought hearing my voice might stress you more. That sentence destroyed everyone standing there. Even Taehyung looked away emotionally after hearing it. Jungkook kept staring at the river while speaking softly. Everything I do became a problem eventually. Jimin shook his head immediately. That's not true. Jungkook laughed weakly. Management meetings, rules, distance. He looked exhausted. Even you agreed I was becoming unhealthy. Jimin's eyes filled instantly because hearing his own decisions reflected back like this sounded horrifying now. Jungkook continued quietly. So I thought maybe everyone would finally relax if I stopped needing people so much. Jimin whispered desperately. Jungkook! Then Jungkook admitted the truth that finally shattered Jimin completely. I spent weeks trying to become someone easier to love. Silence. Absolute silence. Snow fell softly around them while nobody moved. Jimin felt tears hit his face immediately hearing those words. Because suddenly every sleepless night, every fake smile, every ridiculous rule inside Jungkook's notebook made horrifying sense. Jungkook wasn't trying to manipulate anyone emotionally. He was trying to erase parts of himself he thought made him unlovable. Jimin slowly stepped closer until they stood inches apart in the freezing night air. Look at me, Jimin whispered. Jungkook hesitated before finally lifting his eyes, completely exhausted, completely lost. and Jimin finally said the words he should have said months earlier. "You never had to earn staying beside me." Jungkook's expression broke instantly. Then finally, for the first time in months, Jungkook started crying openly in front of the members. Not quietly, not hidden, completely shattered. And Jimin realized right there beside the river that every attempt to emotionally distance himself had only convinced Jungkook he was fundamentally too broken to be loved normally. Back in the studio present day, nobody could speak for several seconds after the memory ended. Jimin's eyes were wet again too now. Jungkook wiped his face roughly before looking away. Then the host finally whispered the question hanging over the entire room. "Was that the moment you stopped trying to leave him?" Jimin stared toward Jungkook silently. Long pause, then quietly, "No." The entire room froze again. Jimin swallowed hard. Because a few weeks later, his voice became heavier. Something happened that made everything even worse. The room went dead silent again after Jimin admitted things somehow became even worse after the river incident. The podcast staff looked emotionally exhausted already, but nobody wanted the recording to stop anymore. The atmosphere had crossed into something too personal, too painful, and somehow impossible to look away from. Jungkook leaned back slowly in his chair now, staring at the ceiling briefly like he already knew exactly which memory Jimin was about to reveal next. Namjoon quietly muttered, "This is the part that changed all of us," under his breath. The host immediately looked toward him. "What happened?" RM didn't answer. He just looked toward Jimin carefully. Jimin's fingers tightened around the microphone. Then finally, after several seconds, he whispered, "The scandal." Immediate tension filled the room. Even Jungkook visibly flinched hearing that word. Flashback. Seoul. 2 weeks after the Han River incident. BTS schedules continued normally on the surface. Performances, interviews, brand shoots. Fans noticed nothing unusual publicly, but privately the atmosphere inside the group had changed completely. Jimin stopped trying to emotionally distance himself from Jungkook after the river incident. He couldn't anymore. Every time he saw Jungkook forcing fake smiles or pretending to be emotionally stable alone, guilt destroyed him. So gradually, quietly, Jimin started staying close again. Sitting beside him naturally, eating meals together late at night, checking if Jungkook slept properly, talking openly again, and for a short while things actually improved. Jungkook laughed more genuinely again, started sleeping normally some nights, stopped writing obsessive rules inside the notebook. The members noticed immediately. Hoseok even joked one evening, "Finally, you two stopped acting like divorced parents." Everybody laughed, even Jungkook. But underneath the relief, another problem quietly started growing. Staff members were still watching them carefully. Management still worried about emotional dependency. And unfortunately, the closer Jimin and Jungkook became again, the more obvious their attachment looked from the outside. Then came the airport incident. The moment everything exploded publicly for the first time. Back in the present-day studio, Taehyung sighed heavily before muttering, "That airport day was hell." Flashback. International airport. Crowded. Chaotic. Fans screaming everywhere. Cameras flashing non-stop. BTS moved through security surrounded by managers and guards while trying to maintain normal idol behavior despite exhaustion. Jimin remembered feeling slightly sick that morning already. Too little sleep. Stress. Overworked. But he pushed through anyway because schedules never stopped. Then suddenly, in the middle of the crowd, a fan shoved aggressively past a security barrier trying to get closer. Everything happened fast after that. Security reacted instantly. The members moved automatically. But Jimin lost balance briefly in the chaos and nearly fell backward into the crowd. Jungkook saw it immediately and completely lost control. "Move!" The scream echoed loudly enough that nearby fans actually froze in shock. Jungkook shoved through staff aggressively to grab Jimin before he fell. Security tried calming the situation, but Jungkook wasn't listening anymore. His entire focus locked onto Jimin only. "Are you hurt?" Jungkook grabbed his shoulders tightly. "Did they touch you?" Jimin tried calming him. "I'm okay." But Jungkook kept looking around furiously at the crowd like he might actually fight someone if necessary. The situation became messy fast. Cameras captured everything. Jungkook yelling, Jungkook pushing through staff, Jungkook holding Jimin protectively while visibly shaking with anger. By nighttime, clips spread online everywhere. Fans argued constantly. Some defended Jungkook's protectiveness. Others criticized him for overreacting publicly. But inside the company, panic started immediately. Back in the studio present day, Jimin closed his eyes briefly. That video made management think nothing had improved at all. Jungkook laughed bitterly beside him. Because honestly, it hadn't. Flashback, company conference room. The atmosphere was worse this time, more serious, more tense. Several executives attended alongside managers now. Jungkook sat silently at the table while clips from the airport incident replayed repeatedly on a screen nearby. Watching himself like that made him physically sick. The executives paused on one frame specifically. Jungkook clutching Jimin protectively while glaring at the crowd with pure panic in his eyes. One executive sighed heavily. "This is exactly what we were worried about." Jungkook stared at the table silently. Another manager spoke carefully. "Your emotional responses around Jimin are escalating publicly now." Escalating. Jungkook hated that word instantly too, like his emotions were some dangerous situation spiraling out of control. "I was protecting him," Jungkook muttered quietly. "We know." "Then what's the problem?" Silence. Then finally the hardest sentence came. "The problem is you react to Jimin like losing him would destroy you." Jungkook stopped breathing for a second because once again, they weren't entirely wrong. The executive continued. "And now cameras are starting to catch it." Jungkook looked away immediately. Shame burned through him again. Then came the decision that changed everything. "We're temporarily separating your schedules where possible." Jungkook froze. "What?" "Different travel arrangements occasionally. Different practice teams when manageable. Less direct emotional dependence." Jungkook immediately stood up from the chair so suddenly it scraped loudly across the floor. "No." The room went silent. One manager tried calming him carefully. "Jungkook, no." His breathing became uneven again. "You can't do that." Another executive answered firmly this time. "We already decided." Jungkook felt panic rising instantly. Not anger, real panic. The same terrifying feeling he used to get whenever Jimin disappeared emotionally from him. "You don't understand," he whispered. "This won't help. It already helped temporarily before." Jungkook laughed bitterly. "No, it didn't." Nobody answered, because deep down some of them knew he was right too. Back in the present-day studio, Namjoon quietly admitted, "That meeting made everything spiral faster." The host frowned. "Why?" RM sighed heavily. "Because this time Jungkook stopped fighting for himself." Flashback again, dorm rooftop. Midnight. Jimin found Jungkook sitting alone outside after the meeting. The city lights reflected faintly across his face while cold wind moved through the dark rooftop silence. Jimin immediately noticed something wrong. Jungkook looked calm, too calm. "They told me what happened," Jimin said carefully. Jungkook nodded once without looking at him. "Okay." Jimin frowned immediately. "Okay." Jungkook shrugged weakly. "Maybe they're right." Jimin froze. "What?" Jungkook finally looked toward him. And honestly, that expression terrified Jimin more than panic ever did, because Jungkook looked emotionally numb now, empty. "Every time something happens to you," Jungkook whispered, "I lose control." Jimin sat beside him immediately. "That doesn't mean separating us fixes anything." Jungkook laughed softly. "Then what does?" Silence. Jimin had no answer anymore. Jungkook stared out over the city while speaking quietly. "I'm tired, Hayoung." Those words hit differently this time. Not physically tired, emotionally exhausted, deeply exhausted. Jungkook rubbed his face slowly. "I keep trying to become normal again." Weak laugh. "But the harder I try, the worse it gets." Jimin whispered carefully, "You're not broken." Jungkook immediately answered, "Then why does everybody treat me like I am?" Silence crushed the rooftop. Because honestly, Jimin didn't know how to answer that either anymore. Then Jungkook quietly admitted something that changed the entire situation again. "There's something I never told anyone." Jimin's chest tightened immediately. "What?" Jungkook hesitated for several seconds, then finally whispered, "The night at the river." He swallowed hard. "I wasn't just thinking about disappearing from BTS." Jimin froze completely. Jungkook looked down at his shaking hands. "I thought maybe everyone would finally stop worrying if I disappeared completely." The air vanished from Jimin's lungs instantly. "Jungkook." His voice barely worked anymore. Jungkook kept staring downward, ashamed. "I didn't have a plan." He spoke quickly now. "I wasn't gonna do anything that night." But his breathing became uneven again. Long pause. "I genuinely believed everybody's lives would become easier without me causing problems all the time." Jimin felt cold all over instantly. Because suddenly every sleepless night, every rule, every apology voicemail became horrifyingly clear. Jungkook hadn't just been emotionally dependent. quietly fallen into a terrifying level of self-hatred while trying to suppress it alone. Jimin grabbed Jungkook's hands immediately. "Don't ever say that again." Jungkook laughed weakly. "See," he looked miserable. "That reaction right there is why I stopped telling people things." Jimin's eyes filled with tears instantly. "Because I care about you. Because I scare you." Silence exploded between them. Jungkook's voice cracked softly now. "Everybody looks terrified whenever I'm honest about how bad things got." Jimin couldn't deny it, because right now, he was terrified, completely terrified. Then Jungkook finally whispered the sentence that shattered Jimin completely. "I think I became someone people only know how to manage now." Back in the podcast studio, several staff members openly cried again. The host looked emotionally overwhelmed too. Jimin wiped tears from his own face before continuing quietly. "That was the moment I realized something horrifying." The room stayed silent, waiting. Jimin looked toward Jungkook carefully. Jungkook didn't think he deserved unconditional love anymore. He paused, voice shaking. He thought he was becoming a burden people tolerated out of responsibility. Jungkook closed his eyes immediately after hearing that out loud, and the silence afterward felt heavier than anything said before. Nobody inside the studio spoke for a long time after that confession. The atmosphere had gone beyond emotional now. It felt fragile, like one wrong sentence could completely break someone in the room. Jungkook sat perfectly still beside Jimin, but his eyes looked distant again, trapped somewhere between exhaustion and memory. The host slowly removed his glasses, visibly overwhelmed by everything he was hearing. And he asked quietly, "Did anyone outside the members realize how serious Jungkook's mental state had become?" Namjoon answered immediately this time. "No." His voice sounded firm. "And we worked very hard to keep it that way." Flashback. Seoul dorm, days after the rooftop conversation. The members unofficially started watching Jungkook constantly without making it obvious. Nobody said it out loud, but everyone silently understood the situation had crossed into dangerous territory emotionally. Hoseok began staying awake later than usual just to make sure Jungkook slept eventually. Taehyung randomly dragged Jungkook into games and late-night conversations, so he wouldn't isolate himself alone. Jin started forcing everyone to eat together more often because Jungkook skipped meals whenever left alone too long. Namjoon quietly rearranged schedules whenever possible to reduce stress around him. And Jimin stopped pretending emotional distance was helping anyone. Completely. He stayed beside Jungkook almost constantly now, not because management wanted it, not because it looked healthy, because every instinct inside him screamed Jungkook was barely holding himself together mentally. For a short time, it seemed to help again. Jungkook smiled more genuinely around the members. He stopped disappearing late at night. His sleep improved slightly. Even the atmosphere inside the dorm felt lighter. Then the anonymous post appeared online. Back in the studio present day, Taehyung cursed quietly under his breath after hearing that memory mentioned. Jimin's expression immediately darkened too. The host frowned carefully. "What anonymous post?" Flashback. Midnight. BTS dorm living room. Namjoon suddenly walked into the room looking unusually serious while holding his phone. Everyone immediately noticed. "Nobody panic," he said first, which of course made everyone panic immediately. Jungkook looked up from the couch while Jimin's stomach already tightened instinctively. Namjoon sat down slowly before showing them the screen. An anonymous online industry post was spreading rapidly through fan communities. Most of it was vague speculation, but one sentence stood out horribly. Certain BTS members appear emotionally dependent on each other to an unhealthy degree behind the scenes. Silence crushed the room instantly. Jungkook's face lost color immediately. Jimin grabbed the phone next. The post continued describing visible favoritism, emotional instability during schedules, and staff concerns over blurred boundaries between members. No names were directly mentioned, but everyone in the room knew exactly who it referred to. Hoseok whispered, "Who wrote this?" Taehyung looked furious already. "Staff." Namjoon shook his head quickly. "We don't know yet." But nobody cared about the source at that moment because Jungkook had gone completely silent. Jimin immediately looked toward him. Bad sign, very bad sign. Jungkook wasn't angry, wasn't defensive. He just stared at the floor motionlessly while the others argued around him. Then quietly, almost too softly to hear, Jungkook muttered, "I ruined everything." Jimin's heart dropped instantly. "No, you didn't." Jungkook laughed weakly without looking up. "They noticed because of me." Namjoon immediately shut his phone off. "Nobody ruined anything." but Jungkook was already spiraling mentally again. Everybody could see it happening in real time. He stood up suddenly from the couch. "I need air." Jimin immediately stood too. "I'm coming with you." Jungkook shook his head instantly. "No." That answer froze everyone. Jungkook never refused Jimin before, not like that. Then Jungkook looked directly at him for the first time, eyes exhausted, hollow. "People are already talking because I can't control myself around you." His voice cracked slightly. "Please don't follow me this time." Then he walked out before anyone could stop him. Back in the studio present day, Jimin looked down immediately. "I should have followed him anyway." The host whispered carefully. "You did." Jimin shook his head slowly. "I thought maybe giving him space was finally the right choice." Jungkook gave a weak, bitter smile beside him. "Worst decision possible." Flashback, Seoul streets, around 1 in the morning. Jungkook wandered alone through freezing winter air while replaying the anonymous post over and over inside his head. Unhealthy, emotional dependence, staff concerns. Every sentence confirmed the fear already destroying him internally for months. Everybody saw him as a problem now. Not just management, not just staff. Random people outside BTS noticed it too. Jungkook remembered physically feeling sick from shame. Because the worst part, he genuinely believed everyone was right. He sat alone near a closed cafe eventually, hood pulled low while snow drifted quietly around empty streets. His phone buzzed constantly. Calls from Jimin, Namjoon, Taehyung, Hoseok. Jungkook ignored all of them. Then finally one message appeared from Jimin. "Please come home." Jungkook stared at the words for a long time before replying with trembling hands. I think home became the problem. Back inside the dorm, Jimin read the message and immediately panicked. Namjoon grabbed his jacket instantly. "We're finding him." But Jimin already looked terrified in a way the members hadn't seen before, because this time felt different. Jungkook's emotional exhaustion had crossed into hopelessness now, and hopelessness was far more dangerous than panic. Back outside, Jungkook kept walking again eventually. Not toward anywhere specific, just moving because sitting still made his thoughts louder. He remembered passing familiar places around Seoul while old memories hit him one after another. Trainee days with Jimin. Late-night convenience store runs. Sleeping side by side after impossible rehearsals. Laughing backstage during stressful tour. Every memory felt painful now because suddenly Jungkook convinced himself he'd poisoned all of it by needing Jimin too much emotionally. Then came the thought that truly terrified him. Maybe management was right. Maybe everyone would finally relax if he disappeared from Jimin's life permanently. Back in the studio present, Jungkook finally spoke quietly again. "That anonymous post broke something in me." Everyone looked toward him immediately. Jungkook rubbed his hands together slowly while talking. "Before that, I still thought maybe things could go back to normal eventually." He laughed weakly. "Afterward, I started believing I was damaging Jimin's life just by staying close to him." Jimin's eyes immediately filled again hearing that. Flashback, around 2:30 in the morning. Jimin finally found Jungkook alone near the riverside walking path again. This time Jungkook didn't even look surprised seeing him approach. He just kept staring at the water silently. Jimin walked beside him carefully. "Why didn't you answer calls?" Jungkook shrugged weakly. "Didn't want to hear everyone worrying again." Jimin's chest tightened. "People worry because they care about you." Jungkook laughed quietly. "That sounds nice until you realize you became the reason everybody's stressed all the time." Jimin stepped directly in front of him now, forcing eye contact. "Stop saying that." Jungkook finally looked up, and Jimin immediately realized something horrifying. Jungkook looked emotionally detached, numb in a way he'd never seen before, like he'd mentally exhausted himself past panic already. "Do you know what hurts most?" Jungkook asked quietly. Jimin stayed silent. Jungkook smiled sadly. "I actually tried so hard not to become this person." Snow drifted around them slowly while his voice cracked again. "I kept making rules, distancing myself. Pretending I was fine." He looked down. "But somehow I still became everyone's problem anyway." Jimin grabbed his arm immediately. "You are not a problem." Jungkook whispered back, "Then why does everyone keep trying to fix me?" Silence hit instantly. Jimin had no answer, because management meetings, boundaries, monitoring, distance, emotional concern. From Jungkook's perspective, it probably really did feel like everybody treated him like something unstable needing correction. Jungkook looked exhausted beyond words now. "I'm tired of making people afraid." Jimin shook his head desperately. "I'm not afraid of you." Jungkook immediately answered, "That's because you don't see yourself clearly either." Jimin froze completely. Jungkook kept speaking softly. You think you're protecting me all the time. Weak laugh. But honestly, he looked directly at Jimin. You were drowning too. The words hit harder than Jimin expected because deep down they were true. Jimin had spent months terrified of losing Jungkook emotionally while simultaneously terrified of how dependent they'd become on each other. He barely slept properly either, constantly monitored Jungkook's moods, panicked whenever Jungkook disappeared, felt responsible for stabilizing him mentally all the time. Somewhere during all the chaos, Jimin became emotionally trapped too. Jungkook saw the realization hit him immediately. See, he whispered sadly. That look right there. Jimin couldn't breathe properly anymore, because for the first time he understood the full truth. This wasn't just Jungkook emotionally relying on him. They had both quietly built their entire emotional survival around each other during the worst years of pressure and isolation. And now neither of them knew how to separate that safely anymore. Jungkook looked toward the river again. Maybe we both forgot who we were without this. Jimin felt tears burn his eyes instantly. Don't say it like that. Jungkook smiled painfully. Why? He swallowed hard. Because it sounds too real. Silence. Then Jungkook finally admitted the darkest thought he'd been hiding. I started wondering if the healthiest thing I could do for you, he paused shakily, was disappear from your life completely. Jimin immediately grabbed his jacket hard enough to stop him mid-sentence. Never say that again. Jungkook looked startled by the panic in Jimin's voice. Jimin's breathing became uneven now too. You don't get to decide my life would be better without you, Jungkook whispered carefully. Wouldn't it? And for the first time in months, Jimin realized he didn't just need to save Jungkook anymore. He needed to stop Jungkook from erasing himself completely. The studio remained completely silent after that last sentence. Nobody behind the cameras even pretended to stay emotionally detached anymore. Several staff members sat with tears openly running down their faces now, but the recording continued because stopping somehow felt impossible. Jungkook kept staring downward, while Jimin sat beside him looking emotionally exhausted, like every memory being dragged into the open was reopening wounds neither of them fully healed from. Then the host quietly asked the question everyone was afraid of. Did Jungkook actually try leaving your life? Jungkook closed his eyes immediately. Jimin's expression fell instantly too, and that reaction alone answered enough already. Flashback, 3 days after the anonymous post incident, the atmosphere inside the dorm had become strange again. Not hostile. Worse. Careful. Everybody started watching Jungkook too closely without meaning to. Every silence worried them. Every late-night disappearance made people anxious. Every fake smile felt suspicious now. Jungkook noticed all of it. Of course he did. He became hyper-aware of how people reacted around him after the management meetings. And slowly, terrifyingly, he started convincing himself everyone would feel calmer if he simply removed himself emotionally from the group. Especially from Jimin. So one morning, without warning, Jungkook stopped answering Jimin completely. No messages, no casual conversations. No eye contact longer than necessary during rehearsals, nothing. At first Jimin thought maybe Jungkook just needed temporary space after the Riverside conversation. But by the second day, panic started building again because Jungkook wasn't angry. He was emotionally disappearing. Back in the studio present day, Hoseok quietly whispered, "Those were the worst days." The host frowned carefully. Why? Hoseok looked genuinely shaken remembering it. Because Jungkook acted like somebody preparing to leave permanently. Silence filled the room instantly again. Flashback. BTS rehearsal studio. Day 2 of Jungkook's emotional withdrawal. The members practiced choreography under harsh lights while staff moved around normally. On the surface, everything looked fine. But Jimin couldn't focus at all anymore because Jungkook felt emotionally unreachable now. Every time Jimin approached him, Jungkook politely stepped away. Every attempt at conversation got short answers. Every moment alone together ended with Jungkook quietly leaving first. It terrified Jimin immediately because this didn't feel like normal distance anymore. It felt final. Then during a short rehearsal break, Jimin finally cornered Jungkook alone near the backstage hallway. Talk to me. Jungkook kept his eyes lowered. About what? Jimin's chest tightened. Don't do that. Do what? Pretend everything's normal. Jungkook smiled weakly. Isn't that what everyone wanted? Jimin froze instantly. Jungkook continued softly. No emotional dependence, no problems, no stress. He finally looked up, eyes exhausted. I'm trying. Jimin grabbed his wrist immediately. This isn't trying, you're shutting down. Jungkook's expression flickered painfully for a second, then disappeared again behind fake calmness. Maybe shutting down is healthier. Jimin stared at him in disbelief. You don't mean that. Jungkook whispered back, I think I do now. Then he gently pulled his wrist free and walked away before Jimin could stop him again. Back in the studio, Jimin rubbed his face slowly before speaking. That was the first moment I genuinely thought I might lose him, the host asked quietly. Because he stopped talking to you. Jimin shook his head immediately. Because Jungkook stopped reacting emotionally at all. Silence. Jungkook finally spoke softly beside him. I thought if I cut myself off first, he paused, it would hurt less later. Jimin looked toward him instantly after hearing that. The pain between them became unbearable again. Flashback, that same night, dorm hallway around midnight. Jimin noticed light still on under Jungkook's room door. He knocked once. No answer, knocked again. Silence. Finally, he opened the door slowly. Jungkook sat on the floor beside his bed, surrounded by scattered papers and notebooks. Most were ripped apart already. Jimin immediately recognized the rule notebook pages torn into pieces around him. Jungkook looked up calmly when Jimin entered, too calmly. What are you doing? Jimin whispered. Jungkook shrugged weakly. Getting rid of things. Jimin's stomach dropped immediately. Why? Jungkook looked down at the shredded notebook pages. Because I'm tired of trying to fix myself. The room felt ice-cold suddenly. Jimin stepped closer carefully. Jungkook! Then he noticed something else on the bed, flight information. His heart stopped instantly. What is that? Jungkook followed his gaze silently, then quietly answered, I asked management about solo overseas training temporarily. Jimin felt physically dizzy hearing that. What? Jungkook spoke like someone discussing the weather, emotionless. Different environment, different schedules, less attachment problems. Jimin couldn't process the words fast enough anymore. You're leaving, Jungkook immediately answered, temporarily. But his eyes looked completely unconvinced even saying it. Jimin grabbed the papers instantly. No, Jungkook sighed tiredly. Hayoung, no, Jimin's breathing became uneven now too. You don't get to disappear because you think people would be more comfortable. Jungkook finally looked frustrated for the first time in days. Why not? His voice cracked suddenly. Everyone keeps acting like I'm emotionally unstable around you. Jimin froze. Jungkook stood up now too, years of exhaustion finally spilling over again. Management watches me constantly. Staff talk about me like I'm fragile. The members stay awake checking if I'm okay every night. His breathing shook harder. Do you know how humiliating that feels? Jimin whispered desperately. Because people love you. Jungkook laughed bitterly. No. He shook his head slowly. Because people are scared of me falling apart. Silence crushed the room. Because deep down, part of that was true too. Jungkook looked completely exhausted now. I'm tired of needing people this much. Jimin stepped closer again. Then let us help you. Jungkook immediately whispered back, what if I can't be helped? That sentence shattered something inside Jimin instantly. Because for the first time, Jungkook genuinely sounded hopeless. Not dramatic, not emotional, truly hopeless. Jimin grabbed his face suddenly with both hands, forcing eye contact. Listen to me carefully. Jungkook froze, tears already formed in Jimin's eyes now. You are not broken beyond fixing. Jungkook's expression immediately cracked hearing that. Jimin kept going before he could pull away again. You are not a burden. You are not ruining my life. His voice trembled harder. And if you disappear because you think that protects me, tears finally spilled down Jimin's face openly now. You will destroy me instead. Silence exploded across the room. Jungkook stared at him completely frozen. Because that was the first time Jimin finally admitted it openly. The emotional dependence wasn't one-sided anymore. Maybe it never truly had been. Jimin's hands trembled against Jungkook's face while he whispered shakily, I became scared too. Jungkook's breathing stopped for a second. Jimin finally confessed everything he'd been hiding. Every time you disappeared emotionally, I panicked. Another tear slid down his face. Every time you stopped sleeping, I blamed myself. His voice cracked completely now. And every time people said we needed distance, he swallowed hard. I felt like somebody was asking me to abandon you while you were drowning. Jungkook's entire expression collapsed hearing that. Back in the studio present day, even Namjoon wiped his eyes quietly now. The host looked completely overwhelmed by the emotional honesty spilling out from years earlier. Jimin continued softly. That was the first night we both stopped pretending only Jungkook was struggling. Flashback again. Jungkook's bedroom. Silence filled the space while both of them stood inches apart emotionally shattered. Jungkook's eyes looked glossy now too. "Why didn't you tell me?" he whispered weakly. Jimin laughed painfully through tears. "Because I thought I was supposed to stay strong for you." Jungkook looked completely devastated hearing that. Then finally, after months of isolation and fear and emotional exhaustion, Jungkook broke completely again. Not angrily, not dramatically. He just collapsed forward into Jimin's arms, shaking uncontrollably, while years of pressure finally exploded out of him all at once. Jimin held him tightly immediately. Jungkook buried his face against his shoulder while crying hard enough he could barely breathe properly anymore. "I'm trying so hard," Jungkook whispered brokenly between breaths. "I swear I'm trying." Jimin held him tighter. "I know." Jungkook shook violently against him now. "I don't know how to become normal again." Jimin closed his eyes while tears kept falling too. "Then stop trying to survive this alone." For several minutes neither of them moved. Jungkook just cried against him while years of hidden panic and shame poured out all at once. And slowly, terrifyingly, Jimin realized something else too. The real danger was never that Jungkook loved him too much. The danger was that Jungkook believed love had to be earned by becoming easier to handle emotionally. Then Jungkook whispered something so quietly Jimin almost missed it. "I thought if I disappeared first." His breathing cracked again. "You'd hate me less when everyone eventually forced us apart." Jimin felt his heart physically ache hearing that. Because all this time, underneath every panic attack and sleepless night, Jungkook had been living in constant fear that losing Jimin was inevitable. And every management meeting, every conversation about boundaries, every worried glance from staff only confirmed that fear more deeply. Back in the present-day studio, Jungkook finally admitted softly, "I genuinely believed everyone would eventually convince Jimin to leave me." Jimin looked at him immediately. Jungkook gave a weak smile without humor. "So I thought maybe leaving first would hurt less." Silence filled the room again. Then Jimin quietly revealed the twist nobody there expected next. "But after that night," he paused carefully, "something happened that made me realize Jungkook wasn't the only person hiding secrets from everyone." The host frowned immediately. "What do you mean?" Jimin looked down slowly. Long pause, then finally whispered, "Somebody inside the company had been leaking private information about us for months." The entire studio froze instantly after that revelation. Even the camera operators looked shocked now. The host blinked several times like he genuinely thought he misheard. "Someone inside the company," he whispered carefully. Jimin nodded once. Slowly, Jungkook's expression darkened immediately beside him, and the tension between the members shifted again into something colder now. Anger. Betrayal. Namjoon leaned back heavily in his chair while Taehyung muttered a quiet curse under his breath. The host looked around the room. "You're saying the anonymous posts weren't random?" Jungkook finally answered this time. "No." His voice sounded flat now, dangerous. "They came from somebody who knew too much." Flashback, Seoul dorm, 1 week after Jungkook's breakdown in his room. Things between Jimin and Jungkook improved slightly again after finally being honest with each other emotionally. Not magically fixed, but different, softer, more honest. Jungkook stopped pretending distance solved everything. Jimin stopped pretending he wasn't emotionally terrified too. And for the first time in months, they actually started talking openly about their fears instead of silently carrying them alone. The members noticed immediately. Jungkook looked less hollow. Jimin slept more. The dorm atmosphere slowly stopped feeling like a disaster waiting to happen. Then another anonymous industry post appeared online. This one was worse. Much worse. Because this time the details became disturbingly specific. Certain BTS members reportedly require emotional monitoring during schedules due to unstable attachment dynamics behind the scenes. The room inside the dorm went silent instantly after Namjoon read it aloud. Because nobody outside the members and internal staff should have known language like that. Emotional monitoring. Attachment dynamics. Those were phrases directly used during management meetings. Jimin felt cold immediately. Jungkook just stared at the floor again without reacting. Which somehow scared everyone even more. Hoseok whispered carefully, "There's no way fans guessed wording like this." Taehyung immediately stood up furious. "Someone's talking." Namjoon nodded grimly. "Yeah." Then came the worst part. Another line farther down the post. One member reportedly struggles emotionally whenever separated from a specific teammate during overseas schedules. Silence exploded, because now it wasn't vague anymore. Whoever leaked this information knew private details about the separation discussions specifically targeting Jungkook and Jimin. Jungkook stood up quietly after hearing that sentence. No anger, no panic, just exhausted resignation. I'm going for a walk. Jimin immediately followed. I'm coming. This time Jungkook didn't argue. Back in the present-day studio, Jimin rubbed his hands slowly before speaking again. That was the night everything changed permanently between us. The host frowned. Because of the leaks, Jimin nodded. Because Jungkook finally realized his worst fear was becoming real. Flashback, empty parking structure rooftop. Nighttime. Cold wind moved across the concrete while distant Seoul traffic echoed below. Jungkook leaned against the railing silently while holding his phone. Jimin approached carefully. Talk to me. Jungkook laughed quietly, not happy. What's left to say? Jimin stopped beside him. This isn't your fault. Jungkook looked at him immediately. Eyes exhausted beyond words. Then why does every leak somehow describe me perfectly? Silence. Jimin had no answer. Jungkook looked away again. People inside the company actually discuss me like I'm unstable. His voice cracked slightly. I thought maybe I was imagining it before. He swallowed hard. Guess not. Jimin felt anger building for the first time stronger than guilt, because suddenly this wasn't just about emotional struggles anymore. Someone had weaponized Jungkook's vulnerabilities privately. Jungkook kept speaking softly. Do you know what the worst part is? Jimin stayed silent. Jungkook smiled weakly. The leaks never mention you struggling too. Jimin froze. Jungkook laughed bitterly. It's always me. He looked down. The unstable one, the attached one, the emotional problem. Another painful silence settled between them, because again, Jungkook wasn't entirely wrong. The company conversations always framed him as the dangerous emotional variable, not the fact both of them had become deeply emotionally dependent during years of pressure and isolation. Jungkook's voice became quieter now. Maybe everyone already decided I'm the unhealthy one. Jimin stepped closer immediately. I never decided that. Jungkook looked at him carefully. But you believed it for a while. That sentence hit brutally because it was true. Jimin's guilt surged immediately again. Jungkook noticed. See, he whispered sadly. That look. Jimin shook his head desperately. I thought I was protecting you. Jungkook laughed weakly. By helping people separate us. The words sliced straight through him. Back in the podcast studio, Jimin admitted quietly that was the first time Jungkook truly sounded angry at me. The host blinked in surprise. Angry? Jungkook nodded slowly beside him. I was. His expression stayed distant. Not because he worried about me. He paused. Because he listened to everyone else before listening to me. Silence filled the room again. Flashback, parking rooftop. Jimin stared at Jungkook in shock after hearing that accusation. You think I chose them over you? Jungkook immediately answered, didn't you? Jimin froze completely. Jungkook's breathing became uneven again now too. Every time management said I was becoming unhealthy, you agreed. Jimin whispered desperately, because I was scared for you. And I was scared too. Jungkook finally snapped loudly. His voice echoed across the empty rooftop. But nobody asked what I actually needed. Silence crashed down instantly afterward. Jungkook looked shaken by his own outburst now. But once he started talking, years of suppressed anger finally poured out. Everyone kept deciding things about me. His eyes burned with emotion now. Distance, boundaries, monitoring. He laughed bitterly. I stopped being a person and became some emotional problem BTS needed to manage quietly. Jimin's chest tightened painfully because hearing Jungkook describe it like that suddenly sounded horrifyingly accurate. Jungkook stepped back now, overwhelmed. Do you know how humiliating it feels hearing people discuss whether you're too attached to someone? His voice cracked harder. Like your feelings became something embarrassing everyone needs to contain. Jimin whispered. Jungkook. But Jungkook shook his head. No, tears formed in his eyes again now too. You know what hurt most? He looked directly at Jimin. You were the only person I thought would stay on my side no matter what. Jimin felt completely shattered hearing that, because deep down he knew Jungkook was right. Even if his intentions were good, he had still participated in conversations framing Jungkook's emotions as something dangerous needing control. Jungkook laughed weakly through tears now. When you agreed with them, he swallowed hard. It felt like losing the only safe place I had left. The words destroyed Jimin instantly. Back in the present-day studio, nobody moved. Even the production team looked emotionally overwhelmed now. Jimin stared at the floor before speaking quietly again. That sentence haunted me for years. Jungkook stayed silent beside him. Flashback, rooftop again. Jimin finally stepped forward despite Jungkook trying to retreat emotionally. You were never a problem to me. Jungkook immediately whispered back. Then why did it feel like everyone kept trying to fix me so you could breathe easier? Jimin froze again, because honestly, during the worst months, part of him probably did hope the pressure would ease somehow, not because he wanted distance from Jungkook, because constantly fearing Jungkook emotionally collapsing had started destroying him too, and Jungkook saw the hesitation in his face immediately. His expression broke all over again. See, he whispered painfully. And now, Jimin grabbed his arm instantly. Listen to me carefully. Jungkook looked exhausted, defeated. Jimin's voice trembled now too. I was drowning. Tears filled his eyes again, but not because loving you was a burden. He swallowed hard. Because I thought if I failed protecting you, I'd lose you forever. Silence hit hard between them. Jungkook stared at him speechless now. Jimin finally admitted the secret he'd hidden from everyone for months. After the voicemail night, his breathing shook slightly. I started having panic attacks every time I couldn't find you. Jungkook's eyes widened instantly. What? Jimin laughed weakly through tears. I hid it. He looked away ashamed. Because everyone already worried about you enough. Jungkook looked genuinely stunned now. Jimin kept talking quietly. Sometimes if you didn't answer messages for too long, he rubbed his hands nervously remembering it. I couldn't breathe properly. Jungkook stepped closer immediately. Hyung, Jimin shook his head. That's why I finally understood. He looked directly at Jungkook now. This stopped being about one person depending on another a long time ago. Silence. Complete silence. Jungkook's expression slowly changed from anger into shock. Then guilt. Jimin continued softly. We both became terrified of losing each other. Jungkook whispered carefully. Why didn't you tell me? Jimin smiled painfully. Because I thought you already carried enough guilt. Then finally came the moment that changed everything permanently between them. Jungkook stepped forward slowly until almost no space remained between them on the freezing rooftop. His eyes looked devastated now for entirely different reasons. You were suffering too, he whispered. Jimin nodded once, tears falling silently now. Jungkook closed his eyes briefly like the realization physically hurt him, because for months he truly believed he alone became the emotional burden destroying everyone around him. But now he finally understood Jimin had been silently breaking apart too. Then Jungkook whispered the sentence that changed the direction of everything afterward. What if they were never trying to save us? Jimin frowned slightly through tears. What? Jungkook looked toward the city lights below, expression slowly hardening now. What if they were just trying to make us easier to control? And for the first time since all the emotional chaos started, the fear between them shifted toward someone else entirely. The entire atmosphere inside the studio changed after that sentence. Up until now, the story had been filled with guilt, fear, emotional dependence, and exhaustion. But suddenly something colder entered the room. Suspicion, betrayal. The host leaned forward carefully. You thought the company was manipulating the situation. Namjoon immediately answered before Jimin could. Not the entire company. His voice stayed calm but firm. But certain people absolutely handled things in ways that made everything worse. Taehyung nodded slowly beside him. Way worse. Jungkook stayed quiet for several seconds before finally speaking again. When you're emotionally unstable, he said softly, people start treating your feelings like they belong to everyone except you. Silence followed immediately because nobody knew how to argue with that. Flashback. Rooftop conversation continued. Cold wind swept across the empty parking structure while Jimin stared at Jungkook in shock after hearing his theory. You think they wanted control? Jungkook looked down at the city lights below. I think once people decided I was emotionally unstable, he swallowed hard. Nobody cared what I actually felt anymore. Jimin's chest tightened again because deep down, he understood exactly what Jungkook meant now. Every conversation had become about managing him, stabilizing him, separating him, monitoring him. Almost nobody ever asked Jungkook directly what would actually help emotionally. Jungkook laughed quietly under his breath. The more afraid people became of my emotions, the less human I felt. Jimin stepped closer slowly. You are human. Jungkook looked at him carefully. Then why did everyone talk about me like I was dangerous? Silence hit hard again. Because honestly, some management discussions really had started sounding like damage control instead of emotional support. Jungkook continued quietly. Every panic attack became evidence I needed boundaries. His voice cracked slightly. Every time I protected you became proof I was unstable. He shook his head tiredly. Nobody noticed I was breaking because I thought losing you was unavoidable. Jimin felt guilt twist violently inside him again, but this time another emotion mixed into it too. Anger, real anger, not at Jungkook. At the people who watched everything happen and somehow kept treating their emotional collapse like a scheduling issue instead of two human beings quietly drowning. Back in the studio present day, the host asked carefully, "Did you confront management after the leaks?" Jungkook laughed softly without humor. "Eventually," Taehyung immediately muttered. "That meeting was insane." Flashback. HYBE conference room, 3 days after the second leak. The atmosphere was already hostile before anyone even sat down. Jimin remembered walking into the room beside Jungkook, while several executives and managers waited silently at the table. Namjoon joined too because he refused letting them handle the situation alone anymore. One executive immediately started professionally. "We understand emotions are high right now," Jungkook interrupted instantly. "Who leaked it?" The room went quiet. The executive exchanged looks with another manager. "We're currently investigating. Who leaked it?" Jungkook repeated again. His voice sounded terrifyingly calm now. One senior manager sighed carefully. "Jungkook, we understand why you're upset." Jungkook laughed quietly. "Upset?" He leaned back slowly in the chair. "You discussed my mental health privately and now strangers online describe me like some unstable, obsessed freak." Silence exploded. Jimin immediately noticed several executives visibly uncomfortable now. Good. They should have been uncomfortable. Jungkook continued quietly. "So I'll ask one more time." His eyes finally lifted toward them directly, cold now. "Who leaked it?" Nobody answered again. Then another executive carefully tried redirecting the conversation. "The larger issue right now is how emotionally dependent this situation has become publicly and privately." Jimin felt immediate anger rise hearing that sentence. Jungkook just stared at the table silently for several seconds. Then finally smiled, but the smile looked completely broken. "There it is again." The executive frowned slightly. "What?" Jungkook's voice stayed eerily calm. "You talk about me like I'm not sitting here." Silence. Jungkook leaned forward now. "Do you know nobody in this company ever once asked why I became emotionally attached like this?" Nobody answered. Jungkook nodded slowly like he expected that. "Years." He looked exhausted again suddenly. "Years of pressure, isolation, no normal life, no privacy. No trust outside 7 people." His breathing became uneven slightly. "And the one person who made me feel safe emotionally became something everyone wanted to regulate." The room stayed silent because again, nobody could deny it. Back in the studio present, Namjoon quietly admitted, "That was the first time Jungkook stopped acting afraid during meetings." The host looked surprised. "What changed?" RM answered softly. He realized nobody else was protecting his humanity anymore. Flashback. Conference room again. Jungkook looked directly toward the executives now. "You know what really destroyed me?" One manager quietly asked. "What?" Jungkook swallowed hard. "The feeling that everybody secretly hoped I'd just become emotionally easier to handle." Jimin felt his chest ache hearing that because he knew exactly where those fears came from now. Management meetings, boundaries, separation plans, emotional monitoring. Even when intentions weren't cruel, the message Jungkook received emotionally was devastating. "Your feelings are becoming inconvenient." Jungkook laughed weakly. "And honestly," he looked down again. "I tried." Silence. "I tried becoming quieter." His voice cracked slightly. "Less attached, less emotional, less difficult." Jimin stared at him speechless now because hearing everything said out loud like this sounded heartbreaking in ways none of them fully realized back then. Jungkook continued softly. "But eventually I realized something." He looked back toward the executives again. "No matter how hard I tried changing myself," long pause, "the real problem was that people got uncomfortable seeing emotions they couldn't control." The room went completely still after that, because suddenly Jungkook didn't sound unstable anymore. He sounded terrifyingly clear. One executive finally answered carefully. "Nobody wanted to control you." Jungkook immediately whispered back, "Then why did everyone keep deciding what my feelings should look like?" Silence. Absolute silence. Jimin looked toward the managers now and realized something horrifying. Most of them genuinely believed they were helping. But somewhere during all the fear and damage control and emotional concern, they stopped treating Jungkook like a person capable of understanding his own emotions. Back in the present-day studio, Jimin finally admitted quietly, "That meeting changed how I saw everything too." The host frowned. "Because you agreed with Jungkook." Jimin nodded slowly. For the first time. I realized we'd spent months reacting to fear instead of listening to each other honestly. Flashback. The meeting eventually ended badly. No direct answers about the leaks. No accountability. Just more conversations about public image, emotional management, and schedule adjustments. Jungkook barely spoke afterward while leaving the building beside Jimin and Namjoon. But once they reached the underground parking garage, Jungkook suddenly stopped walking. Jimin turned immediately. Jungkook. Jungkook looked exhausted, completely drained. I can't keep doing this. Jimin's heart tightened instantly. Doing what? Jungkook laughed weakly. Trying to prove my feelings aren't dangerous. Silence. Then Jungkook quietly admitted something that stunned even Namjoon. I don't think I want to hide anymore. Jimin froze. What? Jungkook looked directly at him now. Not publicly. He shook his head. I know we can't. Then softer, but privately too. Jimin's chest tightened painfully. Jungkook stepped closer slightly. I'm tired of acting like caring about you this much is something shameful. The parking garage suddenly felt suffocatingly quiet. Namjoon looked away respectfully now, understanding immediately this conversation had become deeply personal. Jungkook kept talking softly. Every time people called me emotionally unstable, he swallowed hard. Part of me started believing loving you was something ugly. Jimin felt tears rise instantly again. Jungkook's eyes looked glossy too now, but it never felt ugly to me. Silence exploded between them. Jungkook laughed weakly through emotion. Terrifying? Yeah. Another shaky breath. Overwhelming? Definitely. Then finally, quietly, but never ugly. Jimin could barely breathe anymore hearing that, because for months they'd both allowed outside fear to convince them their emotional connection itself was the problem instead of the isolation and pressure surrounding it. Jungkook looked terrified now too after admitting all this openly, but he didn't look ashamed anymore, and that difference changed everything. Then he finally said the sentence Jimin would remember for the rest of his life. I don't want to survive by pretending you matter less to me than you actually do. The entire emotional direction of their relationship shifted permanently in that moment. Not into romance, not into some dramatic confession, into honesty. Raw, terrifying honesty about how deeply intertwined their emotional survival had become over years of pressure nobody outside BTS could truly understand. Back in the studio present day, the host whispered carefully, What did you say back to him? Jimin stared toward Jungkook silently for several seconds, then finally smiled sadly. Nothing. The host looked confused. Jimin's eyes softened painfully. Because honestly, he laughed quietly through emotion. I started crying before I could answer. The studio broke into soft, emotional laughter after Jimin admitted he started crying before answering Jungkook that night. Not because the moment was funny, because after everything they had revealed, it somehow felt painfully human. Even Jungkook smiled faintly beside him for the first time in a while, small, exhausted, but real. The host wiped his face slowly before speaking again. So after that night, things finally got better. The smile disappeared immediately from both Jimin and Jungkook. And everyone in the room understood the answer before either of them spoke. No, Jimin whispered quietly. That's when things became impossible to ignore anymore. Flashback. Weeks after the parking garage confrontation. The emotional atmosphere between Jimin and Jungkook changed completely after finally admitting the truth to each other. Not romantic confessions, not dramatic promises, something deeper and harder to explain. They stopped pretending their emotional connection could be reduced into unhealthy attachment or dependency alone. They stopped apologizing constantly for needing each other emotionally during overwhelming periods of pressure and exhaustion. Most importantly, Jungkook stopped treating his feelings like something shameful needing punishment. But unfortunately, honesty created another problem too. Because once both of them stopped emotionally distancing themselves, the depth of their bond became impossible for the members not to fully notice anymore. Not in a scandalous way, in a frightening way. Jimin and Jungkook had become each other's emotional anchor so completely that their moods, stress levels, and stability visibly affected one another constantly. If Jungkook spiraled mentally, Jimin immediately became anxious too. If Jimin looked exhausted, Jungkook stopped functioning normally until he knew why. Years of surviving impossible pressure together had quietly rewired them emotionally around each other, and now everyone saw it clearly. Back in the present-day studio, Hoseok quietly admitted, At some point we realized separating them suddenly probably would have destroyed both of them emotionally. The host looked stunned hearing that. Both, Namjoon nodded slowly. People kept focusing on Jungkook because his reactions were more obvious. He paused carefully. But Jimin wasn't stable anymore either. Jimin laughed softly without humor. Not even close. Flashback, BTS rehearsal building, late night, around 1 a.m. Jimin sat alone inside a dark practice room trying unsuccessfully to focus on choreography reviews. His breathing felt uneven again, hands cold, chest tight. Because Jungkook hadn't answered messages for nearly 2 hours after leaving vocal practice early. Rationally, Jimin knew there were dozens of harmless explanations. Showering, working out, sleeping, talking with managers. But after the voicemail night and the river incident, rational thoughts no longer controlled his body properly whenever Jungkook disappeared too long emotionally. Jimin checked his phone again. No reply. Panic slowly climbed higher. Then suddenly the practice room door opened. Jungkook walked inside carrying 2 drinks casually before immediately freezing. "Hayoung," Jimin looked up too fast. Relief hit his face so visibly Jungkook's expression changed instantly. "What happened?" Jimin shook his head quickly. "Nothing." Jungkook stepped closer carefully now. "You look pale." Jimin forced a weak smile. "Just tired." Lie, obvious lie. Jungkook sat beside him slowly. "You thought something happened to me." Silence answered everything immediately. Jungkook stared at him for several seconds after realizing the truth, then quietly whispered, "Oh." Jimin looked ashamed suddenly. "I know it's irrational." Jungkook's face softened painfully now because for the first time he was seeing his own fear reflected back at him through Jimin. Jimin rubbed his hands nervously. "You didn't answer messages and my brain just," he laughed weakly, "went somewhere bad immediately." Jungkook stayed silent, completely silent. Then finally whispered the sentence that terrified him most. "I did this to you too." Jimin immediately shook his head. "No." But Jungkook already looked devastated. "You panic whenever I disappear now." His voice cracked softly. "Just like me." The realization hit both of them brutally hard at the same time. Back in the studio present day, Jungkook admitted quietly, "That scared me more than my own panic attacks ever did." The host frowned carefully. "Why?" Jungkook looked toward Jimin slowly. "Because suddenly he was carrying the same fear I'd been drowning in for months." Silence, flashback, practice room again. Jimin tried calming the situation immediately after noticing Jungkook shutting down emotionally again. "Hey," he grabbed Jungkook's arm gently. "This isn't your fault." Jungkook laughed weakly. "Of course it is." Jimin frowned. "Why would you think that?" Jungkook looked exhausted now. "Because before me, you didn't panic every time someone stopped answering texts." Jimin opened his mouth to argue, but nothing came out, because again, Jungkook wasn't entirely wrong. Jungkook looked toward the floor. "I turned your brain into survival mode too." The guilt in his voice sounded unbearable now. Jimin immediately moved closer. "Listen to me." Jungkook shook his head slowly. "No." His breathing became uneven again. "This is exactly what everyone was afraid of." Jimin froze. Jungkook rubbed his face tiredly. "We didn't help each other heal." Weak laugh. "We just became terrified together." Silence crashed down again, because for a moment, that statement felt horrifyingly true. Jimin remembered his chest tightening painfully hearing it because suddenly every sleepless night, every panic spiral, every desperate search for reassurance between them looked less like stability and more like emotional survival addiction. Jungkook looked completely defeated now. Maybe management was right all along. Jimin immediately answered, "No." But Jungkook kept going quietly. "This isn't healthy anymore." He swallowed hard. "You can't even relax if I disappear for a few hours." Jimin's eyes burned instantly because hearing it described out loud sounded terrifying. Jungkook looked miserable now too. "I never wanted this to happen to you." Then softly, "I'd rather destroy myself than watch you become like me." Jimin grabbed Jungkook's face immediately again before he could emotionally retreat further. "Stop deciding what I can handle." Jungkook froze. Jimin's eyes looked fierce despite tears threatening again. "You keep talking like caring about you ruined my life." His voice shook harder now. "But you know what actually ruined us?" Silence. "Fear." Jungkook stared at him speechless. Jimin continued quietly. "Fear of losing each other, fear of pressure, fear of judgment, fear of becoming burdens." Another shaky breath. "That's what destroyed us." The room fell silent again while Jungkook absorbed every word slowly. Jimin's expression softened painfully now. "Not loving each other too much." Jungkook's entire face broke hearing that sentence. Back in the studio present day, Taehyung quietly whispered that conversation changed everything. The host looked toward him. Why? Taehyung leaned back slowly. Because it was the first time either of them stopped treating their bond like something shameful. Flashback. Practice room. Jungkook looked emotionally overwhelmed now while Jimin still held his face carefully. What if people are right? Jungkook whispered weakly. What if this really is unhealthy? Jimin stayed silent for several seconds, then finally answered honestly. Maybe parts of it are. Jungkook's expression fell immediately, but Jimin continued before he could spiral again. Because we were isolated, exhausted, terrified constantly. He swallowed hard. Not because you're broken for needing someone emotionally. Jungkook stared at him quietly now. Jimin's thumbs brushed tears away from his face gently. And honestly, his own voice cracked slightly. I needed you too. Silence exploded again. Jungkook looked stunned every time Jimin admitted that openly, like part of him still couldn't fully believe it. Jimin laughed weakly through emotion. You think you were the only reason we survived those years? Another tear slid down his face now too. Half the time I kept going because I knew you were waiting for me backstage. Jungkook's breathing shook instantly hearing that. Jimin smiled sadly. You became my safe place too, idiot. Jungkook immediately started crying again after that sentence. Not loudly this time. Quiet tears sliding down while years of shame slowly cracked apart piece by piece. Because for so long he genuinely believed his feelings were one-sided damage he inflicted onto Jimin unfairly. But now Jimin kept admitting the terrifying truth openly too. They saved each other. Repeatedly. Through years nobody outside BTS truly understood emotionally. Jungkook finally whispered carefully, Then what do we do now? Jimin stared at him silently for several seconds, then honestly answered, I don't know. Weak laugh. But I know pretending we matter less to each other won't fix anything anymore. Jungkook closed his eyes briefly while tears continued falling softly. Then slowly, almost fearfully, he leaned forward until his forehead rested against Jimin's shoulder. Not dramatic, not romantic, just exhausted surrender after months of fighting himself. Jimin wrapped his arms around him immediately. And for the first time in nearly a year, neither of them apologized for it. Back in the present-day studio, the host whispered carefully, Was that when you finally accepted you couldn't leave each other? Jimin looked toward Jungkook. Long silence. Then quietly, No. The room froze again instantly. Jimin swallowed hard before continuing. Because right when we finally stopped hiding from ourselves, his voice darkened slightly. The company gave us an ultimatum. The room instantly turned cold again after Jimin mentioned the ultimatum. The tiny relief from the previous memory disappeared completely. Jungkook's jaw tightened beside him immediately, while Namjoon leaned back with visible frustration crossing his face again. Even the host looked nervous, asking the next question. What kind of ultimatum? Jimin didn't answer immediately. He stared down at the microphone for several seconds like he still hated remembering that conversation. Then quietly, almost bitterly, he said, Choose stability or choose each other. Silence detonated across the studio. Several staff members physically reacted hearing that sentence. One assistant whispered, Oh my God, under her breath before covering her mouth. Jungkook closed his eyes briefly beside Jimin, like even now the memory exhausted him emotionally. Flashback. HYBE Executive Office. Late evening. Rain hitting the windows softly outside. Jimin and Jungkook sat side by side across from several senior executives while Namjoon remained nearby silently. Nobody smiled. Nobody pretended this meeting was routine anymore. The atmosphere already felt wrong before anyone spoke. One executive folded his hands carefully before starting. We've spent months trying to support both of you. Jungkook immediately looked away at the wording. Support. Another manager continued gently. But recent events made it clear the current situation isn't emotionally sustainable. Jimin felt his stomach tighten instantly. He already knew where this was going. Then came the sentence that changed everything permanently. You two need healthier emotional separation moving forward. Jungkook laughed quietly under his breath. Tired, hollow. There it is again. The executive stayed calm. This isn't punishment. Jungkook whispered. Then why does it always feel like one? Silence. Jimin immediately noticed something dangerous though. Jungkook didn't look panicked anymore. He looked emotionally exhausted beyond fear now, and somehow that scared Jimin more. The manager continued carefully. We're recommending temporary long-term schedule adjustments. Namjoon frowned immediately. Adjustments? Another executive answered. Separate overseas activities where possible. different accommodations consistently, reduced private dependency. Jungkook stared forward silently, motionless. Jimin felt anger rising instantly now too. You think forcing distance fixes trauma? The executives exchanged looks again. One finally answered professionally, we believe emotional independence is necessary for both your mental health long-term. Jungkook suddenly smiled, small, bitter. So basically, he looked up slowly now, if we keep needing each other emotionally, we become the problem. Nobody answered directly, and that silence told them everything. Back in the present-day studio, Taehyung muttered angrily, I hated that meeting. Hoseok nodded immediately. All of us did. The host looked confused. The members knew, Namjoon answered quietly, not every detail immediately, but enough. He paused carefully. Enough to realize people were treating their emotional connection like a crisis instead of asking why it became necessary in the first place. Flashback, executive office again. Jimin leaned forward now, visibly angry for one of the first times during these discussions. You keep talking about emotional dependence like it appeared out of nowhere. His voice sharpened. Do you know how isolated we were for years? Silence. Jimin continued before anyone interrupted. No normal relationships, no privacy, constant pressure, constant fear. His breathing grew uneven now too. And somehow the person who kept Jungkook alive emotionally became the issue everybody wanted to regulate. The room stayed silent. One executive finally answered carefully, nobody is denying your importance to each other. Jungkook laughed quietly. That's exactly what you're doing. His eyes looked cold again now. You just say it politely. Another manager sighed heavily. Jungkook, this isn't about blame. Jungkook immediately whispered back, then stop talking about me like I'm dangerous. Silence exploded again. Jimin looked toward him instantly because the exhaustion in Jungkook's voice sounded unbearable now. Not angry anymore. Hurt, deeply hurt. Jungkook rubbed his hands slowly while speaking softer now. Do you know what it feels like hearing people discuss whether your emotions should be limited? He looked down. Like loving someone too much turned into a behavioral problem. Nobody answered. Nobody could. Because regardless of intention, that was exactly how the situation started feeling emotionally for him. Then the executive finally revealed the ultimatum openly. If this continues unchecked, long pause, we may need to permanently restructure certain activities for everyone's well-being. Jimin froze immediately. Namjoon's expression darkened. Jungkook stayed terrifyingly calm. Too calm. Restructure. He repeated softly. The executive nodded carefully. Temporary distance may prevent more severe emotional complications later. Jungkook laughed again. But this time the sound genuinely scared Jimin, because it sounded empty. You mean separate us now before things become impossible later? Silence. The executive didn't deny it. Back in the present-day studio, Jungkook finally admitted quietly, that was the moment I almost left BTS. The entire room froze instantly. The host stared at him in shock. What? Jimin looked devastated hearing the memory again too. Jungkook leaned back slowly in his chair while speaking. Not because I hated the members. His voice stayed calm. Because I genuinely thought removing myself would fix everything. Flashback. Underground parking garage outside HYBE. Rain pouring heavily now. The meeting had ended disastrously. Namjoon argued with executives afterward while Jimin followed Jungkook silently toward the parking area. Jungkook walked ahead without speaking until they reached the far end of the garage alone. Then suddenly he stopped. Jimin immediately noticed something wrong. Jungkook looked emotionally gone again. Numb, hollow. Jungkook. No response. Jimin stepped closer carefully. Talk to me. Jungkook stared toward the rain outside the garage entrance while speaking quietly. They're never gonna stop. Jimin's chest tightened. What? Jungkook laughed weakly. The meetings, the monitoring, the fear. Another silence. As long as I stay close to you, everyone keeps acting like something terrible is about to happen. Jimin grabbed his arm instantly. Don't. Jungkook looked at him tiredly. Don't what? Disappear into your head again. Jungkook smiled sadly. Maybe disappearing is still the best option. Jimin's heart dropped instantly. Don't say that. But Jungkook kept going softly. You heard them. He swallowed hard. Eventually they'll force distance anyway. Jimin shook his head desperately. No. Jungkook finally looked directly at him now, eyes devastated beyond words. Then what's the ending here, Hyung? Silence. Jimin couldn't answer because honestly, he didn't know anymore either. Jungkook laughed weakly through emotion now. We keep getting more attached until everyone panics. Another shaky breath. Or we tear ourselves apart slowly pretending we don't need each other. Jimin felt tears rising immediately because hearing the situation reduced to those choices sounded hopeless. Jungkook rubbed his face tiredly. I can't survive more years of people treating my feelings like a threat. Then finally came the sentence that shattered Jimin completely. Maybe losing me now hurts less than losing me later. Jimin immediately grabbed Jungkook's jacket hard enough to stop him from turning away. Stop deciding my pain for me. Jungkook froze. Jimin's voice cracked violently now. You keep talking like leaving protects me. Tears spilled down his face openly. But every single time you try disappearing, his breathing broke harder. You destroy me instead. Jungkook's expression immediately collapsed hearing that. Jimin shook with emotion now too. I am so tired of you thinking your existence only hurts people. Silence echoed through the garage while rain hammered outside. Jungkook whispered carefully, Then what am I supposed to do? Jimin stared at him desperately. Stay. Jungkook's breathing stopped for a second. Jimin stepped closer until almost no space remained between them now. I don't care if this is messy. Another tear slid down his face. I don't care if people misunderstand it. His voice trembled harder. But I'm not surviving another year pretending losing you wouldn't destroy me too. Jungkook looked completely shattered now, because this was no longer vague emotional dependence hidden behind silence and fear. Jimin was openly claiming him emotionally now despite everything. Despite the pressure, despite the consequences, despite the fear. Back in the present-day studio, the host whispered carefully, What did Jungkook say? Jimin slowly looked toward him beside the microphone. Long silence filled the room again. Jungkook swallowed hard before finally answering himself quietly. I asked him why. The host frowned. Why what? Jungkook's eyes looked glossy again now. Why he kept choosing me even after everything. Silence, flashback, parking garage. Jungkook stared at Jimin through tears now while whispering shakily, Why are you still here? Jimin looked stunned. Jungkook kept speaking softly. After the panic attacks, the pressure, the meetings, his voice cracked harder. After I made your life this hard. Jimin immediately grabbed his face again before he could spiral further. You idiot. Tears filled his eyes completely now too, because somewhere along the way, his voice shook violently. You became home to me too. And for the first time since all the chaos started, Jungkook finally looked at Jimin like he believed staying might actually be possible. Nobody inside the studio moved after that sentence. The silence felt heavy in a completely different way now. Not sharp, not chaotic, just emotionally overwhelming. Jungkook kept staring downward while Jimin quietly wiped his face beside him. Even the host looked visibly shaken hearing the words, You became home to me too. For several seconds, the only sound inside the room came from somebody behind the cameras trying unsuccessfully not to cry. Then the host finally whispered, Was that the moment everything changed? Jimin slowly shook his head. No. His voice sounded tired now. That was the moment we stopped lying. Flashback, underground parking garage. Rain continued pouring outside while Jungkook stood frozen in front of Jimin, tears still running silently down his face. The words hung painfully between them. You became home to me too. Jungkook looked genuinely stunned hearing it spoken out loud. Because despite everything they survived together, despite all the emotional dependency, panic, fear, and exhaustion, a part of him still believed eventually Jimin would realize staying beside him wasn't worth the damage anymore. But Jimin was still there, still choosing him. Even now, Jungkook's breathing trembled unevenly while whispering softly, You really mean that? Jimin laughed weakly through tears. I wouldn't still be standing here if I didn't. Silence crashed around them again. Then Jungkook did something that completely broke whatever emotional walls still existed between them. He stepped forward slowly and buried his face against Jimin's shoulder while shaking violently again. Not from panic this time. Relief. Years of fear finally cracking open all at once. Jimin held him immediately. Tight. Protective. Like letting go would physically hurt. Jungkook's voice came out broken against his shoulder. I thought everybody would eventually convince you to leave me. Jimin closed his eyes hard hearing that confession because now he understood the deepest fear controlling Jungkook all along. It was never just abandonment. It was the belief that once people saw how emotionally intense he really was, they would slowly pull Jimin away from him piece by piece until nothing remained. And honestly, some people had tried. Jimin whispered quietly into Jungkook's hair, Nobody gets to decide that except me. Jungkook's hands tightened against his jacket immediately. Back in the present-day studio, Jungkook admitted softly, "That was the first time I stopped planning how to disappear." The host looked at him carefully. "You were really thinking about leaving everything?" Jungkook nodded once without hesitation. "Completely." Silence filled the room instantly again. Jungkook looked exhausted remembering it. "Not because I wanted freedom." He swallowed hard. "Because I thought becoming smaller emotionally was the only way everyone else could finally breathe." Namjoon looked visibly emotional hearing that now too. Flashback. After the parking garage conversation, things between Jimin and Jungkook shifted permanently. Not into perfection, not into peace, into brutal honesty. They stopped pretending distance automatically meant healing. They stopped acting like their emotional connection itself was the enemy. Most importantly, Jungkook stopped apologizing every time he needed reassurance emotionally. And Jimin stopped hiding his own fear behind fake strength. But honesty created visibility, and visibility created tension everywhere around them. The members noticed immediately. Managers noticed. Staff noticed. Jimin and Jungkook no longer acted emotionally restrained around each other in the same artificial way. If Jungkook struggled mentally, Jimin stayed beside him openly. If Jimin looked exhausted, Jungkook immediately checked on him without pretending indifference anymore. They weren't dramatic, weren't inappropriate. But the emotional gravity between them became impossible to ignore once they stopped hiding it constantly. Some staff became uncomfortable immediately, others quietly sympathetic. The members, they mostly just looked relieved. Back in the studio present day, Hoseok smiled sadly. "Honestly, after a while we stopped caring whether it looked unhealthy." The host blinked. "What do you mean?" Hoseok shrugged softly. "Because they looked more alive together than apart." Silence followed immediately. Taehyung nodded too. "Whenever people forced distance, both of them got worse." Flashback. BTS dorm kitchen, late night. Jin quietly watched from the counter while Jungkook sat beside Jimin eating ramen after schedules. Nothing dramatic happened. No emotional conversation. No breakdowns. Jungkook just looked relaxed for the first time in months while listening to Jimin complain about choreography corrections. Jin noticed it immediately. The difference was obvious now. Jungkook's shoulders weren't tense. Jimin wasn't anxiously checking his phone every 30 seconds anymore. They looked calm, safe. Jin glanced toward Namjoon nearby, who noticed the same thing silently. Then Jin whispered quietly, "They really are each other's safe place." Namjoon sighed softly. "Yeah." Jin looked concerned. "That scares people." Namjoon nodded slowly. "Because most people don't understand what years of survival together does to someone emotionally." Silence settled around the dorm again. Then Namjoon quietly admitted something he'd never said out loud before. "I think people kept trying to separate them because their bond made everyone confront how damaged all of us actually became." Jin looked toward him immediately. Namjoon laughed weakly. "Jungkook just showed it openly first." Back in the present-day studio, even the host looked emotional hearing that. "You think the situation reflected bigger problems inside the group?" Namjoon answered honestly. "Not problems with love." Paused carefully. "Problems with pressure." Flashback. Weeks later. Another meeting. Smaller this time. Only BTS members and a few managers. The atmosphere felt tense immediately because everybody knew the situation surrounding Jimin and Jungkook hadn't magically disappeared. One manager carefully started discussing upcoming overseas schedules and accommodation plans, then casually mentioned separate room arrangements again. Jungkook immediately went silent. Jimin noticed. Taehyung noticed too. Namjoon sighed quietly. The manager continued professionally. "We still believe maintaining healthier emotional boundaries." "Stop calling it that." Everyone froze. Jimin had interrupted this time. The room went completely silent because Jimin almost never openly challenged staff during meetings like this. The manager blinked carefully. "Excuse me." Jimin's expression stayed calm, but his eyes looked sharp now. "You keep talking about our relationship like it's a psychological issue instead of two people surviving pressure together." Silence exploded. Jungkook looked stunned beside him. So did the members. Jimin continued before anyone interrupted again. "Every conversation becomes about fixing attachment instead of asking why we became emotionally dependent in the first place." His breathing stayed controlled but emotional underneath. "You isolated us for years. Put us under pressure normal people can't imagine. Then acted surprised when we became each other's emotional support system." Nobody answered. Jimin looked directly at the managers now. "And honestly," long pause, I'm tired of hearing Jungkook treated like he's dangerous for loving people deeply. Complete silence filled the room afterward. Jungkook stared at Jimin like he couldn't fully process what he was hearing, because this time Jimin wasn't quietly protecting him privately anymore. He was openly standing beside him, publicly inside the company itself. One manager finally answered carefully, "Nobody thinks Jungkook is dangerous." Jimin immediately whispered back, "Then stop making him feel like he is." That sentence shattered the entire room emotionally. Back in the studio present day, Jungkook smiled faintly through tears remembering it. "I almost cried during that meeting." Taehyung laughed quietly. "Almost?" Jungkook wiped his face. "Okay, fine, I did." Even Jimin smiled weakly now. Flashback. After the meeting ended, Jungkook followed Jimin quietly toward the dorm elevators while the other members stayed behind. Neither spoke for several seconds. Then finally Jungkook whispered softly, "Why did you do that?" Jimin looked confused. "Do what?" Jungkook stared at him carefully. "Nobody ever defended me like that before." Jimin's chest tightened instantly hearing how genuine that sounded. They stepped inside the empty elevator together while rain tapped softly against the building windows outside. Then Jimin quietly answered the simplest truth he knew. "Because I got tired of watching people make you feel ashamed for having emotions." Jungkook looked down immediately, overwhelmed again. Jimin stepped closer. "You spent years apologizing for needing people." His voice softened painfully. "And somewhere along the way, I realized everybody kept asking you to become less human just so they'd feel more comfortable." Jungkook's breathing became uneven again hearing that. Jimin gently grabbed his hand before continuing. "I'm not doing that anymore." Silence filled the elevator while Jungkook stared at their hands quietly. Then finally, barely above a whisper, he admitted the truth that terrified him most. "I don't know how to survive without you emotionally anymore." Confession hung heavily between them. Raw, honest, dangerous. Jimin looked at him for several seconds before answering quietly too. "Then maybe we stop trying to survive alone." Jungkook's eyes widened slightly hearing that, because for the first time Jimin wasn't talking about fixing him, or distancing, or emotional boundaries. He was talking about facing everything together openly, even the ugly parts, even the fear, even the dependence. The elevator doors opened softly onto their dorm floor. But neither moved immediately. Jungkook looked terrified still, but not ashamed anymore, and that difference changed the course of everything afterward. Back in the studio present day, the host whispered carefully, "So that was the moment you both chose each other." Jimin slowly looked toward Jungkook beside him. Long silence. Then quietly answered, "No." The room froze again instantly. Jimin swallowed hard before continuing. "Because right when we finally stopped being afraid of ourselves." His expression darkened slightly. Something happened that nearly destroyed Jungkook for real. The studio atmosphere changed instantly again. Whatever fragile emotional relief had finally disappeared the moment Jimin said those words. Jungkook lowered his head immediately beside him while the members went silent all over again. The host looked genuinely nervous now asking the next question. "What happened?" Jimin didn't answer right away. He looked toward Jungkook first, almost checking silently whether he still wanted to continue. Jungkook stayed quiet for several long seconds. Then finally nodded once. Small, heavy. "Tell it," he whispered. Flashback, 2 months after the elevator conversation. Things on the surface looked calmer publicly. BTS schedules continued. Performances continued. Interviews continued. Fans noticed nothing unusual beyond occasional exhaustion. But privately, Jimin and Jungkook were navigating something terrifyingly fragile together now. They had stopped emotionally running from each other. Which meant all the buried trauma, panic, and fear they'd hidden for years started surfacing openly instead. Some nights were peaceful. Some nights were disasters. Jungkook still had moments where he disappeared emotionally without warning. Jimin still panicked when he couldn't find him. But now they actually talked about it honestly afterward instead of pretending everything was normal. And slowly, painfully, healing had finally started, until the airport incident. Back in the present-day studio, Taehyung immediately looked furious again the moment those words were mentioned. Hoseok rubbed his face heavily while Namjoon sighed like the memory physically exhausted him. The host frowned carefully. "Airport incident?" Jungkook laughed quietly without humor. "That day changed everything." Flashback. Incheon Airport, overseas departure day, chaos everywhere, fans screaming, cameras flashing non-stop, security trying desperately to control movement through the terminal. The members moved together quickly while staff surrounded them tightly. Standard idle chaos, normal on the outside, except Jungkook had already looked emotionally overwhelmed before they even arrived. Jimin noticed immediately that morning. Jungkook barely slept the night before, barely ate breakfast. Hands shaking slightly while getting ready. Jimin quietly asked him several times if he was okay. Jungkook kept insisting yes. Lie, obvious lie, but schedules couldn't stop, so they went anyway. Inside the airport terminal, the crowd pressure became worse than usual immediately. Fans pushed too close. Security struggled. Flashing cameras exploded from every direction nonstop. Jungkook kept his head lowered while walking beside the members, breathing becoming visibly tighter. Jimin noticed instantly, so did Taehyung. Then suddenly someone in the crowd screamed something loud enough to cut through the chaos. "Jungkook can't survive without Jimin," another voice followed immediately after. "They should separate them already," more shouting. More phones pointed directly at them. Jungkook froze mid-step for half a second, just half a second, but Jimin saw it, saw the exact moment those words hit him emotionally. Jungkook's breathing visibly changed immediately afterward. Faster. Shallow. Dangerous. Jimin moved closer instinctively while security kept pushing everyone forward through the crowd. Then another fan shouted loudly, "Jungkook looks obsessed with Jimin." Cameras flashed harder, somebody laughed nearby, and suddenly Jungkook completely stopped walking. Back in the studio present day, even the host looked horrified hearing this now. "People actually yelled those things," Namjoon nodded grimly. "Loud enough for all of us to hear." Flashback. Airport terminal. Everything happened fast after that. Jungkook stood frozen in the middle of the crowd while security kept yelling directions around them. His face lost all color instantly. Jimin grabbed his arm immediately. "Jungkook!" No response. Jungkook stared downward, breathing too fast now. Cameras everywhere. Fans recording everything. Security trying desperately to move them again. Then suddenly Jungkook ripped his arm away from everyone and walked quickly toward the nearest side exit corridor without warning. The members froze in shock. "Jungkook!" Jimin immediately chased after him while managers yelled behind them. They found Jungkook inside an empty emergency hallway near the loading area seconds later. And the moment Jimin saw him clearly, his heart stopped. Jungkook was having a full panic attack, worse than any before. Jungkook leaned against the wall, struggling violently to breathe while his hands shook uncontrollably. His entire body looked frozen between panic and emotional collapse. Jimin rushed toward him instantly. Hey, look at me." Jungkook shook his head hard, unable to focus. "I can't." His breathing cracked violently. "I can't do this anymore." Jimin grabbed both sides of his face immediately. "Breathe." Jungkook's eyes looked completely terrified now. "They're right." Jimin froze. Jungkook kept shaking harder. "Everyone sees it now." Another broken breath. "Everybody thinks I'm insane around you." Jimin's chest tightened painfully. "No," but Jungkook spiraled harder now. "I tried fixing it." Tears streamed down his face openly. "I tried becoming normal." His breathing became dangerously uneven. "Why can't I just be normal?" Back in the present-day studio, Jungkook covered his eyes briefly with one hand while remembering it. His voice sounded rough now. "That was the closest I ever came to completely breaking." Silence crushed the room. Jimin quietly continued the story. Flashback. Emergency hallway. Jungkook slid down the wall onto the floor, shaking uncontrollably now while security and staff stayed outside, giving them space. Jimin knelt in front of him, desperately trying to stabilize his breathing. "Listen to me." Jungkook shook violently. "I ruined everything." Jimin grabbed him harder. "Look at me." Jungkook finally looked up, completely shattered, tears everywhere, fear everywhere. "I'm destroying BTS." That sentence physically hurt Jimin hearing it. Jungkook's voice cracked apart completely now. "People laugh at us because of me." Another broken breath. "Management keeps panicking because of me." His hands trembled violently against his chest. "You keep suffering because of me." Jimin immediately pulled him forward into his arms before he could spiral further. "Stop!" Jungkook buried his face against him while hyperventilating harder now. "I'm tired." His voice sounded small suddenly, terrifyingly small. "I'm so tired of feeling wrong all the time." Jimin held him tightly while his own eyes filled instantly too, because hearing Jungkook say that finally revealed the deepest wound underneath everything. It was never really about attachment, or dependency, or panic attacks. Jungkook genuinely believed there was something fundamentally wrong with the way he loved people emotionally, and years of pressure only deepened that shame until it nearly destroyed him completely. Back in the studio present day, Jimin quietly admitted, "That hallway changed my life." The host looked toward him carefully. "Why?" Jimin's expression looked exhausted remembering it. Because for the first time, he swallowed hard. "I realized Jungkook wasn't scared of losing me anymore." Silence. He was scared his existence itself hurt everyone around him. The room went completely still. Flashback. Emergency hallway. Jungkook slowly pulled away from Jimin's shoulder eventually, still shaking badly. His eyes looked empty now, defeated. "Maybe everyone would really be happier if I disappeared." Jimin felt something inside him snap hearing that sentence. Completely snap. Suddenly all the fear, guilt, exhaustion, helplessness, and rage he'd carried for months exploded at once. "Enough!" Jungkook froze immediately because Jimin almost never raised his voice at him like that. Jimin grabbed his shoulders tightly now, tears already falling down his face too. "I am so sick of hearing you talk about yourself like this." Jungkook stared at him shocked. Jimin's breathing shook violently now too. "You think loving deeply makes you broken." Another tear slid down his face. "You think needing people means you deserve to disappear." His voice cracked completely. "Who taught you that?" Silence detonated between them. Jungkook looked speechless. Jimin kept going before he could retreat again. "Management, fans, pressure." His chest rose unevenly now. Or was it all the years people kept treating your emotions like something dangerous? Jungkook's entire face crumbled hearing that. Jimin pointed toward the airport terminal outside angrily. "Those people screaming don't know you." Tears kept falling harder now. "They don't know how many nights you kept the members together emotionally." Another shaky breath. "They don't know how hard you fight yourself every single day just to survive this life." Jungkook immediately started crying again hearing that. But Jimin wasn't finished. "And if this industry taught you that becoming emotionally numb is the only way to deserve love," his voice broke completely now, "then this industry failed you." Silence filled the hallway so heavily neither of them moved afterward. Jungkook stared at Jimin like he'd never heard someone defend him that fiercely before. Because honestly, maybe he hadn't. Jimin's breathing slowly steadied while tears still streamed down his face. Then finally he whispered the sentence that shattered Jungkook completely. "You are not hard to love." Jungkook broke instantly after hearing those words. Completely. Years of shame collapsed all at once while he grabbed Jimin tightly and cried harder than ever before. Not quietly anymore. Not controlled. Real ugly, devastated crying from someone emotionally exhausted beyond limits. And Jimin held him through all of it without letting go once. Back in the studio present day, several people behind the cameras openly cried now too. Jungkook wiped his face silently while staring downward, then finally admitted softly, "That was the first time I believed maybe I deserved to stay." Nobody inside the studio tried hiding their emotions anymore after that confession. The atmosphere had completely shifted beyond entertainment now. Even the host looked emotionally overwhelmed sitting across from them. Jungkook stayed quiet beside Jimin while softly rubbing his hands together, almost nervous about how much of himself had already been exposed publicly during this recording. Then the host carefully asked the next question. "After the airport incident, did things finally start healing?" Jimin slowly exhaled through his nose before answering. "Not immediately." He looked down briefly. "Because healing someone who spent years believing their emotions were dangerous isn't fast." Silence settled again. Then Jungkook quietly added, "Especially when the world keeps proving those fears right sometimes." Flashback. Overseas hotel. 3 nights after the airport breakdown. The members had arrived safely overseas despite the disaster at the terminal, but the emotional aftermath stayed heavy around everyone. Jungkook barely spoke during the flight, barely slept afterward. He looked emotionally drained in a way that scared even the members now. Not panicked anymore, just exhausted. Empty. Jimin noticed immediately that Jungkook stopped reacting emotionally to almost everything around him after the airport incident, and that scared him far more than crying ever did. Because Jungkook's panic at least meant he was still fighting emotionally. This silence felt like surrender. Back in the studio present day, Hoseok admitted quietly, "We were terrified he'd given up internally." The host frowned. "Given up?" Namjoon answered softly on himself. Flashback, hotel hallway around 2 in the morning. Jimin woke up suddenly after noticing Jungkook's bed empty again. Immediate panic hit his chest before he could stop it. He checked the bathroom. Empty. Balcony. Empty. Then he spotted faint light underneath the practice room door at the end of the hotel floor. Jimin rushed there instantly. Inside, Jungkook sat alone on the floor wearing headphones while staring blankly at nothing. Music wasn't even playing. Jimin's chest tightened painfully at the sight. Jungkook looked emotionally gone again. Jungkook! Jungkook slowly looked up, expression hollow. Sorry, didn't mean to wake you. Jimin immediately sat beside him. Why are you here alone? Jungkook shrugged weakly. Couldn't sleep. Lie again. But this time Jimin didn't push immediately. He just stayed there beside him quietly for several moments, then finally whispered, Talk to me. Jungkook laughed softly under his breath, empty sound. About what? Jimin's stomach dropped because that tone reminded him of the worst months again, emotionally detached. Jungkook rubbed his hands slowly while staring toward the dark mirrored wall ahead. Do you ever get tired? Jimin frowned carefully. Tired of what? Long silence. Then Jungkook whispered the most dangerous sentence yet. Of carrying me emotionally. Jimin froze instantly. Jungkook kept talking softly before he could interrupt. You keep saying I'm not hard to love. Weak laugh. But loving me looks exhausting. Jimin immediately turned toward him fully. Stop. But Jungkook shook his head slowly. No, really. His eyes stayed distant. You barely sleep anymore. Another pause. You panic every time I disappear. Another weak, bitter smile. You defend me constantly. Then finally, what exactly am I giving you back besides stress? The room inside the hotel suddenly felt ice cold, because this wasn't panic anymore. This was self-erasure. Jungkook genuinely could no longer see his own value outside the emotional damage he thought he caused others. Back in the studio present day, Jimin quietly admitted, that conversation scared me more than the airport breakdown. The host looked surprised. Why? Jimin's eyes looked distant, remembering it. Because Jungkook stopped sounding emotional. Silence. He sounded convinced. Flashback, hotel practice room. Jimin stared at Jungkook in disbelief after hearing that question. What exactly am I giving you back besides stress? Then suddenly anger hit him again, not explosive anger, heartbroken anger. You really don't see it. Jungkook frowned slightly. See what? Jimin laughed weakly in disbelief. You think all you ever gave people was pressure. Another tear threatened immediately now. Do you know how many times you kept me alive emotionally too? Jungkook looked stunned hearing that again, like no matter how many times Jimin said it, part of him still couldn't fully accept it. Jimin moved closer now. When I was collapsing from pressure during tour, who stayed awake with me? Silence. When I hated myself after mistakes, who kept reminding me I deserved to stay? Jungkook looked downward quietly now. Jimin's voice softened painfully. When all of us felt isolated and exhausted and emotionally trapped, he swallowed hard. You loved us harder than anyone. Jungkook's eyes immediately filled again hearing that. Jimin grabbed his hand tightly. That's not something ugly. Silence filled the room again. Jungkook whispered carefully, then why does it hurt everyone? Jimin froze for a second, then quietly answered the truth. Because people don't know what to do with emotions this intense. Jungkook looked toward him slowly. Jimin continued softly. And honestly, weak laugh. Sometimes neither did we. That honesty changed something important in the conversation immediately. Because for months everybody either demonized their bond or romanticized it emotionally. But the truth was messier, more human. Their connection saved them sometimes, hurt them sometimes, terrified them constantly, but none of that made it fake or shameful. Jimin looked directly at Jungkook now. We became too responsible for each other emotionally. Jungkook nodded faintly. Yeah, Jimin squeezed his hand gently. But that happened because we were surviving impossible pressure together. Silence. Not because loving you is a disease. Jungkook closed his eyes immediately after hearing that. Another tear escaped down his face. Back in the studio present day, the host quietly asked, Did Jungkook believe you? Long silence filled the room. Jungkook answered first this time. Not completely. Weak smile. Not yet. Flashback, hotel practice room. Jungkook finally leaned back against the mirrored wall, exhausted after crying quietly for several minutes. Jimin stayed beside him silently. No pressure. No fixing, just there. Eventually Jungkook whispered softly, I don't know who I am without all this fear anymore. Jimin looked toward him carefully. Jungkook laughed weakly. I spent so long trying not to lose you. His eyes looked tired. That somewhere along the way I forgot how to exist calmly. That confession hit Jimin painfully because honestly, same. Their emotional worlds had revolved around fear for so long that peace itself now felt unfamiliar. Jimin looked down quietly before finally admitting something too. Sometimes I got scared you needed me more than you needed yourself. Jungkook froze, slightly hearing that honesty. Jimin quickly continued before misunderstanding could grow again. Not because I wanted distance. His voice softened. Because I wanted you to see your own value even when I wasn't beside you. Silence. Jungkook stared downward while absorbing that carefully, then finally whispered, I don't know how yet. Jimin smiled sadly. I know. Another long silence passed. Then slowly, cautiously, Jungkook asked the question he'd secretly feared for months. What if someday you get tired anyway? Jimin looked at him instantly. Jungkook's voice cracked slightly. What if eventually loving me really does become too heavy? There it was. The deepest fear underneath everything finally spoken out loud completely. Not abandonment, not separation. The terror that one day Jimin would finally decide Jungkook's emotions cost too much to carry. Jimin moved immediately after hearing it. He grabbed Jungkook's face gently again, forcing eye contact. Listen carefully. Jungkook's breathing slowed slightly. Jimin's eyes looked fierce now despite tears sitting there too. If we survive this, he swallowed hard. It won't be because you became less emotional. Silence. It'll be because you finally stopped believing you need to earn love by suffering quietly. Jungkook stared at him speechless. Jimin's voice softened into something almost fragile now. I'm not staying because you're easy. Another tear slipped down his face. I'm staying because you matter to me. Complete silence filled the room afterward. Jungkook's expression slowly cracked apart again hearing that simple truth, not because it was dramatic. Because for years he genuinely believed people only stayed around him out of responsibility, guilt, or fear he'd collapse otherwise. But Jimin kept choosing him consciously, not despite the difficulty, including it. Back in the present-day studio, Jungkook quietly admitted, that sentence stayed in my head for years afterward. The host looked emotional again. Because you finally believed him. Jungkook gave a weak smile. Because nobody had ever loved me without trying to change me first. Silence shattered the room emotionally again. Then Jimin quietly revealed something nobody expected next. But the real turning point actually happened later that same night. The host frowned carefully. What happened? Jimin slowly looked toward Jungkook beside him. Long pause, then softly admitted, that was the first time Jungkook finally told me what really happened during trainee years. The entire room went silent again after Jimin said that. Even Jungkook visibly tensed beside him now, like this was the one memory that still hurt differently from everything else. The host noticed immediately. Trainee years? He asked carefully. Jungkook lowered his eyes toward his hands, long silence. Then finally he nodded once. Yeah. His voice sounded quieter now, smaller somehow. That's where everything actually started. Flashback. Overseas hotel practice room. Night still deep outside the windows. The mirrored room felt dim and quiet except for the faint city lights leaking through the curtains. Jimin sat beside Jungkook on the floor while silence stretched between them after the conversation about fear and emotional exhaustion. Jungkook looked emotionally drained now, vulnerable in a way Jimin hadn't seen before. Then suddenly Jungkook whispered something unexpected. Do you remember when I first moved to Seoul? Jimin blinked slightly, surprised by the question. Of course, Jungkook smiled weakly. You were the first person who kept talking to me even when I barely answered. Jimin's chest softened, immediately remembering those years. Tiny, shy Jungkook, homesick, quiet, scared, always trying too hard to prove himself useful. Jungkook looked down again. I never told you how bad it really was back then. Jimin frowned slightly. What do you mean? Long silence. And finally Jungkook admitted quietly, I used to cry alone almost every night during trainee years. The words hit Jimin harder than expected. Because yes, everyone knew trainee life was difficult, but something about the way Jungkook said it now felt deeper, personal, hidden. Jungkook rubbed his hands together slowly while speaking. I was 13. Weak laugh. I didn't know anybody. Another pause. I missed home so badly sometimes I felt physically sick. Jimin's chest tightened immediately. Jungkook continued softly, but I thought if I showed weakness, people would regret choosing me. Silence filled the room again. Back in the present-day studio, Namjoon quietly admitted, none of us realized how lonely he really was back then. Taehyung nodded too. Jungkook hit it well. Jungkook laughed softly without humor. I tried. Flashback, practice room. Jungkook stared toward the floor while years-old memories slowly surfaced now. Everyone thought I adjusted well because I trained hard. His voice stayed calm, but his eyes looked distant. But honestly, another weak smile. I was terrified every day. Jimin listened silently beside him. Jungkook swallowed hard. I thought if I stopped being useful, everyone would stop wanting me there. Jimin's heart physically hurt hearing that sentence because suddenly so many things about adult Jungkook made painful sense. The constant need to earn love, the fear of becoming a burden, the panic around disappointing people emotionally. Jungkook kept talking quietly now, like once the memories started surfacing he couldn't stop them anymore. Back then, every compliment felt temporary. His fingers tightened slightly together. Every mistake felt dangerous. Another silence. I became obsessed with being needed. Jimin looked toward him immediately after hearing that. Jungkook laughed weakly. Because being needed felt safer than being loved. The room went completely still. Back in the present-day studio, even the host looked visibly emotional now. That's heartbreaking. Jungkook shrugged softly, still avoiding eye contact. It felt normal at the time. Flashback. Hotel practice room again. Jimin stared at Jungkook quietly while the truth slowly connected together inside his head. Jungkook didn't become emotionally terrified overnight. The fear had been there since childhood. BTS pressure just magnified it until it became unbearable. Jungkook looked exhausted remembering it all now. Then BTS got bigger. Another weak laugh. And suddenly everybody needed something from me constantly. He swallowed hard. Performance, stability, perfection. Silence. I got good at giving people what they needed. Jimin whispered carefully, but nobody asked what you needed. Jungkook smiled sadly immediately. Exactly. Another long silence filled the room. Then Jungkook finally admitted the deepest truth underneath everything. When I met you. His voice softened. You were the first person who stayed beside me even when I had nothing useful to offer. Jimin froze completely. Jungkook looked down quickly after saying it, almost embarrassed. You talked to me when I was awkward. Weak laugh. Fed me when I forgot to eat. Another pause. Stayed awake with me when I missed home. His breathing grew uneven slightly now too, and you never made me feel like I had to earn it. Tears instantly filled Jimin's eyes hearing that. Because he genuinely never realized those small things affected Jungkook that deeply emotionally. Jungkook's voice cracked softly now. I think part of me attached to you so hard because... Long pause. You felt safe before BTS became scary. Silence exploded emotionally across the room. Back in the present-day studio, Jimin wiped his face immediately while Jungkook stared downward silently beside him. The host whispered carefully, so Jimin became tied to your sense of safety emotionally. Jungkook nodded slowly. Yeah. Another pause. And once life started getting harder, weak laugh. I think my brain stopped knowing the difference between needing comfort and needing him specifically. Silence filled the studio again because finally, after hours of storytelling, Jungkook had spoken the deepest truth underneath everything openly. Not obsession, not unhealthy fixation. Survival wiring formed during childhood loneliness and years of pressure. Flashback, hotel practice room. Jimin slowly moved closer again after hearing everything. His eyes looked devastated now too because suddenly he understood why every attempt at emotional distance felt catastrophic to Jungkook. Jimin wasn't just another important person emotionally. In Jungkook's mind, he became psychologically tied to safety, stability, and belonging itself since adolescence. Jungkook rubbed his face tiredly. I hated myself for it. Jimin immediately whispered, don't. But Jungkook shook his head. No, really. Tears slid quietly down his face now. I kept thinking normal people don't panic this much about losing someone. His breathing trembled slightly again. Normal people don't build their entire emotional stability around one person. Jimin stayed silent for several seconds, then finally answered honestly. Maybe not. Jungkook's expression fell immediately, but Jimin continued softly. But normal people also don't survive the kind of life we did. Silence. Jungkook looked at him quietly now. Jimin's voice became gentler. You were a kid. Another tear escaped his eyes too. You came to Seoul alone, spent your entire adolescence under pressure most adults couldn't survive. He swallowed hard. Of course your heart grabbed onto the people who made you feel safe. Jungkook stared at him speechless, because for years everyone framed his emotions as excessive without fully acknowledging the environment that created them. Jimin kept talking softly. You know what I think really happened? Jungkook whispered carefully. What? Jimin smiled sadly. I think nobody taught you how to feel loved without feeling afraid it could disappear. Silence shattered the room emotionally again. Jungkook's entire face crumbled instantly hearing that, because deep down it was true. Every important thing in his life always felt conditional somehow. Success, praise, stability, approval, even love. Everything could disappear if he failed badly enough, except Jimin kept staying anyway, through panic attacks, through emotional collapse, through fear, through shame. Jungkook started crying quietly again now, exhausted by the emotional honesty of the conversation. Jimin immediately pulled him into his arms again without hesitation. This time Jungkook didn't fight it at all. He just buried his face against Jimin's shoulder while years of hidden loneliness finally surfaced completely. Back in the present-day studio, Jungkook whispered softly, "That was the first night somebody made me feel broken things could still deserve love." Nobody inside the room could even pretend not to be emotional anymore after that. Several staff members openly wiped tears while the host sat speechless. Then Jimin quietly admitted something nobody expected. "But Jungkook still wasn't telling me everything yet." The host blinked. "There was more," Jimin nodded slowly, expression darkening again. "Because later that same night," he looked toward Jungkook carefully, "he finally admitted why hearing fans scream those things at the airport destroyed him so badly." Silence filled the room again. Jungkook closed his eyes briefly. Then whispered, barely audible, "Because it wasn't the first time someone made me feel ashamed for needing people emotionally." The atmosphere inside the studio became unbearably heavy after Jungkook said that. Nobody moved. Nobody interrupted. Even the cameras felt invisible now. Jimin slowly turned toward him beside the table, eyes already full again because he knew exactly what memory was coming next. The host looked hesitant speaking now, almost afraid to push further. But eventually he whispered carefully, "What happened?" Jungkook stayed quiet for a long time. Long enough that several people thought maybe he wouldn't answer. Then finally, without lifting his head, he spoke softly. "During trainee years, somebody once told me people would get tired of me if I kept acting emotional." Silence hit the room like a physical force. Flashback. Overseas hotel practice room. Night nearly over now. The city outside remained dark while Jungkook sat beside Jimin on the floor, emotionally exhausted after hours of finally telling truths he buried for years. His eyes looked distant now, trapped halfway between past and present memories. Jimin stayed silent beside him, letting him speak at his own pace. Jungkook swallowed slowly before continuing. "I was probably 14. Weak laugh. Maybe 15. He rubbed his hands together nervously. "I don't even think the person meant to hurt me." Another pause, but they said something that never left my head afterward. Jimin's chest tightened immediately. Jungkook whispered quietly, "People eventually leave when you become emotionally too much." Silence filled the practice room. Jungkook smiled bitterly. "And honestly," he stared toward the floor, "part of me believed it immediately." Jimin felt anger rise inside him instantly hearing that, because suddenly everything connected together even more painfully now. Jungkook didn't just fear abandonment randomly. Somebody planted the idea inside him during the most vulnerable years of his life, and years of pressure watered that fear until it became emotional poison. Jungkook kept talking quietly. "After that, every time I cried," he laughed weakly, "I felt embarrassed immediately." Another pause. "Every time I needed reassurance, I apologized." Jimin whispered softly, "Jungkook," but Jungkook shook his head slightly. "No, listen." His breathing trembled unevenly now. When BTS became huge, it got worse. Silence. Because suddenly millions of people watched everything. Another shaky breath. "And every time someone called me clingy, obsessive, emotional, unstable," his voice cracked softly. "It felt like proof they were right about me all along." Back in the present-day studio, several staff members openly cried now without hiding it anymore. Namjoon rubbed his eyes heavily while Taehyung stared downward silently beside him. The host whispered carefully, "You carried that fear for all those years." Jungkook nodded once. "Every day." Flashback. Practice room. Jimin stared at Jungkook in complete heartbreak now while finally understanding the true scale of the emotional damage hidden underneath everything. This was never just about fame, pressure, or emotional dependence. Jungkook genuinely built his identity around the terror of becoming too much for people to keep loving. Jimin moved closer slowly. "Why didn't you tell me before?" Jungkook laughed softly without humor. "Because I thought if I said it out loud," he swallowed hard, "it would sound pathetic." Jimin's expression immediately tightened. "No." Jungkook's eyes looked glossy again. "You don't understand." Another weak breath. "Every panic attack felt humiliating." Silence. "Every time I needed you felt humiliating." Jimin's chest hurt so badly now he almost couldn't breathe. Jungkook kept staring toward the floor while tears slid quietly down his face again. That day at the airport, his voice shook harder. When people yelled, "I looked obsessed with you." Another pause. I suddenly felt 14 again. Silence shattered emotionally around them. Jungkook closed his eyes tightly now, like everyone could finally see what was wrong with me. Jimin immediately grabbed his hand tightly after hearing that. "Nothing is wrong with you." But Jungkook's face twisted painfully. Then why does loving people feel this terrifying? The question hung heavily between them. Raw, honest, broken. Jimin looked at him silently for several seconds before finally answering the deepest truth he knew. Because somewhere along the way, his voice softened painfully. "You learned love could disappear the moment you became inconvenient emotionally." Jungkook's breathing immediately broke hearing that sentence. Because once again, Jimin had somehow found the exact wound underneath all the fear. Back in the present-day studio, Jimin quietly admitted, "That was the moment I stopped seeing Jungkook's fear as weakness." The host looked toward him carefully. "What did you start seeing instead?" Jimin answered without hesitation. "A survival response." Silence filled the room again. Flashback, hotel practice room. Jungkook wiped his face tiredly while whispering softly, "I kept trying to become easier emotionally." Jimin stayed quiet beside him. Jungkook laughed weakly. "I thought if I became calmer, quieter, less attached." Another pause. "People wouldn't leave." Jimin looked devastated hearing that because he remembered all those months Jungkook tried emotionally distancing himself while secretly collapsing inside. Jungkook swallowed hard. "But every time I pulled away from you," his voice cracked, "I felt like I couldn't breathe properly anymore." Silence. "That scared me so much." Jimin finally moved directly in front of him now, forcing Jungkook to look at him fully. "Listen carefully." Jungkook's eyes looked fragile now, exhausted. Jimin's own voice shook too. "You are not weak for needing love." Silence. "You are not disgusting for getting attached to people who make you feel safe." Another shaky breath. "And you are not broken because losing people scares you." Jungkook immediately started crying harder again hearing those words. Jimin grabbed his face gently while continuing. "Honestly," weak tearful laugh, "after the life we survived together." His forehead rested lightly against Jungkook. "Now, I'd be more worried if you didn't feel anything anymore." That sentence completely shattered the final emotional wall Jungkook still carried inside himself. Suddenly he grabbed Jimin tightly again while crying openly into his shoulder. But this time the crying felt different. Not panic, not shame, release. Years of self-hatred slowly breaking apart piece by piece underneath the weight of finally being understood instead of judged. Jimin held him through all of it quietly. No embarrassment, no apology, just there, steady, safe. Eventually Jungkook whispered something so quietly Jimin almost didn't hear it. "I thought if people saw the real me emotionally." Breathing shook. "Nobody would stay." Jimin immediately answered without hesitation. "I saw you." Jungkook froze slightly against him. Jimin's arms tightened gently around him. "And I stayed." Silence filled the practice room completely afterward, deep, healing silence for the first time in years. Back in the present-day studio, Jungkook wiped tears from his face slowly before finally speaking again. "That night changed how I saw myself." The host asked carefully. "How?" Jungkook gave a small emotional smile. For the first time, he looked toward Jimin beside him. "I stopped seeing my emotions as something people survived." Silence. "And started believing maybe they were something someone could choose willingly." Jimin looked down immediately after hearing that, visibly emotional again. Taehyung quietly wiped his eyes beside them while Hoseok shook his head softly like the memory still hurt even now. Then the host whispered the final question carefully. "So after all of this, why couldn't you leave Jungkook?" The room fell silent again. Jimin looked toward Jungkook for several long seconds before finally answering. His voice came out soft, honest, certain. "Because I realized Jungkook spent most of his life believing love was something he had to earn by becoming less difficult emotionally." Another pause. "And I couldn't be another person who taught him that disappearing was the only way to deserve staying." Complete silence swallowed the studio after that answer. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Then Jungkook quietly reached over under the table and held Jimin's hand without saying a word. And this time, nobody in the room looked uncomfortable anymore. End hook. Next episode tease. But years later, one private letter Jungkook wrote during the darkest period of his life would finally surface between the members. And what Jimin read inside it nearly destroyed him all over again. And years after the airport incident, after the panic attacks, after the meetings, after the nights where both of them thought they were destroying each other emotionally, something changed quietly inside BTS that nobody outside the group ever fully noticed. Jungkook slowly stopped apologizing every time he needed comfort. Jimin slowly stopped pretending he could carry everyone alone without breaking too. The members stopped treating their bond like a crisis waiting to explode and started understanding it for what it really was. Two people who survived impossible years together and accidentally became part of each other's emotional survival system along the way. It wasn't perfect. It was never perfect. There were still arguments. Still moments where Jungkook spiraled into fear too quickly. Still nights where Jimin became overwhelmed carrying his own emotions while trying to protect everyone else. The difference now was simple. They stopped running from the truth. Jungkook no longer believed his emotions automatically made him dangerous. Jimin no longer believed protecting Jungkook meant hiding how much he mattered emotionally. And once those lies disappeared, healing finally became possible. Not fast, not magically, but real. Months after the overseas tour, Jungkook eventually began speaking privately with professional therapists consistently for the first time without treating it like punishment. Not because management forced him, because Jimin convinced him needing help did not mean he failed. That conversation alone took weeks. Jungkook hated the idea at first. He kept insisting other people deserved support more than him, kept minimizing his panic attacks, kept calling his emotions dramatic. Until one night, Jimin finally snapped again and told him, "If you broke your leg, you wouldn't call yourself weak for needing treatment. So stop acting like emotional pain deserves less care." Jungkook cried after that too. Honestly, he cried a lot during that period, but slowly the tears stopped feeling shameful. Therapy helped him realize something terrifying and freeing at the same time. Most of his fear never came from loving people too deeply. It came from believing love would disappear the second he became emotionally inconvenient. Once he finally understood that difference, pieces of his life started making sense for the first time. The panic, the obsession with being needed. The terror of abandonment, the desperate need to stay useful emotionally so nobody would leave him behind. None of it made him monstrous. It made him wounded, and wounds could heal if people stopped treating them like personality flaws. Jimin changed too. For years, he secretly carried the belief that protecting everyone meant sacrificing himself emotionally until nothing remained. Watching Jungkook collapse finally forced him to confront his own damage. He realized he spent years acting emotionally strong because he was terrified the group would fall apart if he ever admitted how overwhelmed he actually felt too. But somewhere along the way, Jungkook accidentally taught him something important. Vulnerability did not always destroy people. Sometimes it saved them. The members became closer after everything, not because the pain disappeared, but because the walls between them finally cracked open. Namjoon stopped carrying leadership pressure silently every second of every day. Taehyung became more honest when loneliness hit him hard emotionally. Hoseok stopped pretending endless positivity fixed everything. Jin started openly checking on the younger members instead of hiding concern behind jokes constantly. Even Yoongi, quiet as always, began staying beside people longer during difficult nights instead of disappearing into work immediately. The group survived because eventually they stopped performing strength for each other and started choosing honesty instead. And strangely enough, once BTS stopped treating emotional struggle like failure internally, Jungkook began recovering faster than anyone expected. Not instantly, but steadily. He learned how to calm panic before it swallowed him completely, learned how to exist alone sometimes without immediately assuming abandonment was coming next, learned how to separate temporary fear from permanent reality. Most importantly, he slowly learned he deserved love even during ugly emotional moments. That lesson took years. Some scars never vanished completely. Certain comments online still hurt him more than he admitted publicly. Airports remained difficult sometimes. Long periods away from the members still triggered anxiety occasionally. But now when fear appeared, he no longer faced it alone while secretly hating himself for feeling it. The biggest change happened quietly one evening back at the dorm long after the chaos settled. Jimin had fallen asleep on the couch after schedules while the members watched movies nearby. Jungkook sat beside him silently for a while before Namjoon eventually noticed something strange. Jungkook looked calm, completely calm. No tension in his shoulders, no anxious checking, no panic hiding underneath his expression, just peaceful, Namjoon asked softly, "You okay?" Jungkook looked toward sleeping Jimin for a second before answering. "Yeah." Small smile. Real smile this time. "I think I finally understand something now." Namjoon waited quietly. Jungkook looked down at his hands before speaking again. "For years I thought loving someone deeply meant eventually losing yourself." Silence filled the dorm softly. Then Jungkook looked back toward Jimin again and whispered, "But maybe real love is when somebody helps you find yourself again instead." Namjoon never forgot that sentence afterward, because honestly, it described all of them. BTS survived fame, pressure, loneliness, and emotional collapse not because they were invincible idols, but because somewhere underneath everything, they kept choosing each other even during the ugliest moments. And years later, during one final podcast recording near the end of their enlistment era, the host asked Jungkook a question that made the entire room emotional one last time. "After everything, what's the biggest thing Jimin gave you?" Jungkook stayed quiet for several seconds while thinking carefully, then finally answered in a voice softer than anyone expected. "Permission." The host looked confused. "Permission," Jungkook nodded slowly, "to stop treating my emotions like something people needed to survive." Silence filled the room again immediately. Jungkook smiled faintly through tears before continuing. "Most of my life, I thought the best thing I could do for people was become easier, smaller, less emotional." He looked toward Jimin sitting beside him, but he stayed beside me until I finally understood something. Another long pause. "Love doesn't become real when you stop being difficult." His voice cracked slightly. "It becomes real when somebody sees the difficult parts and stays anyway." Jimin immediately lowered his head because tears finally overwhelmed him again after hearing that. The members laughed emotionally around them while staff wiped their eyes quietly behind cameras. Then the host turned toward Jimin for one final question. "And what did Jungkook give you?" Jimin looked toward Jungkook silently for several long seconds before answering. "A reason to stop pretending I was always okay." Complete silence swallowed the room again. Jimin smiled weakly. "He trusted me with the ugliest parts of himself emotionally." Another pause. "And honestly," his eyes filled again, "that forced me to finally face my own too." Jungkook looked down immediately, emotional again. Jimin laughed softly through tears before adding one final sentence. "People think love is only about protecting someone." He shook his head slowly. "But sometimes love is the person who refuses to let you disappear into self-hatred quietly." Nobody spoke after that. Nobody needed to. Because in the end, this was never a story about obsession, scandal, or emotional weakness. It was a story about what happens when people spend too many years surviving impossible pressure without being taught how to hurt safely. It was about loneliness, fear, trauma, loyalty, and the terrifying courage required to let another person see you completely without running away. Jungkook once believed becoming emotionally smaller was the only way people would keep loving him, but Jimin stayed long enough to prove the opposite. And maybe that was the real reason he could never leave Jungkook. Because somewhere during all those years of chaos and survival and pain, Jimin realized something simple that changed both of their lives forever. Jungkook never actually needed someone to fix him. He just needed someone who wouldn't abandon him while he learned how to stop abandoning himself.